12-year-old smiled during trial for killing his grandparents. Then the judge made history. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Everyone thought they knew what happened in that house. A quiet neighborhood in Riverton, Oregon. A crime so brutal it didn't seem possible in a town where people still left their doors unlocked. And at the center of it all, a 12-year-old boy with eyes too calm for someone his age. His name was Elliot Brennan. And on November 14, 2018, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom was packed that day. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras flashing every time the judge spoke. Outside, protesters held signs that read, "Justice for the innocent" on one side of the street, and "Lock him away forever" on the other. Inside, Elliot sat perfectly. Still, he didn't cry, he didn't tremble. He didn't look down at his hands the way most children would when the world was watching. He just sat there, his small frame swallowed by the wooden chair, his expression unreadable. Some people said he looked scared. Others said he looked guilty. But just a few, said he looked like he was waiting. The crime itself had torn Riverton apart. On the night of September 3, 2018, someone died in the Brennan household. The victim was Margaret Brennan, Elliot's grandmother. She was 72 years old, a retired librarian, and by all accounts, a woman who never raised her voice. She lived with her husband, Raymond Brennan, and their grandson, Elliot, in a modest 2-story house on Maple Ridge Road. Raymond found her body just after midnight. He'd been watching television downstairs when he heard a sound. Something falling, he said. He called out to Margaret, but she didn't answer. So he climbed the stairs, slow and careful, the way a man with bad knees does when he knows something isn't right. What he found in the bedroom changed everything. Margaret was lying on the floor beside the bed, her glasses broken on the carpet. There was blood, but not much. The room was in disarray. A lamp overturned, a picture frame cracked on the dresser. It looked like there had been a struggle. Raymond called 911 at 12:17 a.m. When the police arrived, they found Elliot in his room, sitting on the edge of his bed, fully dressed. His shoes were, and his hands were folded in his lap. He looked up at the officers when they opened the door, and, according to the report, he said only one thing: "Is she okay?" The lead detective on the case was Vincent Mallory, a 23-year veteran of the Riverton Police Department. He was known for his instincts, his ability to read people. And when he looked at Elliot that night, something didn't sit right. Most kids would have been hysterical, Mallory later told reporters. Crying, asking what happened, wanting to see their grandmother. But not Elliot. He was calm. Too calm. The investigation moved quickly. Elliot was questioned the next morning. His grandfather wasn't present. Raymond was at the hospital in shock, unable to process what had happened. A social worker sat with Elliot instead, and a court-appointed attorney who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The interview was recorded, and that tape changed everything. In the recording, Elliot's voice is soft, measured. He answers every question without hesitation. Yes, he was home that night. Yes, he heard his grandmother fall. No, he didn't see anyone else in the house. No, he didn't know what happened, but then Detective Mallory asked him something simple. "Elliot, were you upset with your grandmother?" Elliot paused, just for a second. Then he said, "Sometimes." "Why?" Another pause. "Because she made me do things I didn't want to do." The prosecutor later used that line as the foundation of the entire case. He admitted motive, she said during the trial. He admitted resentment, and in a moment of anger he acted on it. But motive wasn't enough. The defense argued that Elliot was a child, a small, quiet child who weighed 90 pounds. How could he overpower a grown woman? The answer came from the autopsy. Margaret Brennan didn't die from blunt force trauma, as originally suspected. She died from suffocation. The medical examiner found evidence of pressure applied to her chest and throat. It didn't take much strength, the report said. Just persistence. and there were fibers found under her fingernails, fibers that matched the fabric of Elliot's sweatshirt. The defense tried to explain it away. Maybe she grabbed him earlier that day. Maybe the fibers transferred during a hug. But the prosecution painted a different picture. A boy who snapped, who held his grandmother down, until she stopped breathing, and then calmly returned to his room as if nothing had happened. The trial lasted 6 weeks. Witnesses were called. Neighbors testified about Elliot's behavior, quiet, polite, but a little off. Teachers said he was smart, maybe too smart for his age. One classmate said, Elliot once told him he knew how to make people believe anything. He said it like a game, the boy testified, like he was proud of it. Raymond Brennan took the stand only once. He was frail, broken. When the prosecutor asked him if he believed Elliot was capable of killing his wife, Raymond looked across the courtroom at his grandson and said, I don't know what to believe anymore. The defense called no witnesses. On the final day of the trial, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict with a shaking voice. Guilty of murder in the first degree. Elliot didn't react. He just sat there, his hands folded on the table, his face blank. The sentencing hearing was 2 weeks later. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Judith Carver, looked at Elliot for a long time before she spoke. This is not a decision I make lightly, she said. But the law is clear. The nature of this crime, the evidence presented, and the lack of any mitigating factors leave me no choice. Elliot Brennan, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom erupted. Some people cheered, others sobbed. Elliot's attorney sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. And Elliot? Elliot smiled. It was small, barely noticeable. But the court sketch artist caught it, and the next day, that drawing was on the front page of every newspaper in Oregon. A 12-year-old boy sentenced to die in high prison, smiling. The case became a national sensation overnight. Talk shows debated whether a child could truly be evil. Advocacy groups called for reform. Psychologists weighed in on whether Elliot understood what he'd done. But no one asked the question that mattered most. What if everyone was wrong? That's where I come in. My name is Jordan Hayes, and I'm a documentary filmmaker. I specialize in criminal cases, the ones that don't add up, the ones where the truth got buried under assumptions and fear. I've spent the last 2 years digging into the Elliot Brennan case, and what I've found isn't just troubling, it's terrifying. Because the more I looked, the more I realized the crime may not be what it seemed. The boy in that courtroom may not be who everyone thought he was. And the real question isn't whether Elliot Brennan killed his grandmother. It's whether he was the one pulling the strings all along, or if someone else was pulling his. Everyone thought they knew what happened in that house, until we heard the tape, before the crime, before the trial, before the world knew his name. Elliot Brennan was just a kid. At least, that's what people said when I started asking questions. A quiet kid, a good kid. The kind who didn't cause trouble, didn't stand out, didn't make waves. But the more I dug into his life before September 3rd, 2018, the more I realized something unsettling. No one really knew Elliot Brennan at all. He was invisible. Elliot came to live with his grandparents, Margaret and Raymond, when he was 7 years old. His mother, Claire Brennan, was Margaret and Raymond's only daughter. She'd left Riverton years earlier, chasing what Raymond later called pipe dreams and bad men. Claire had Elliot young, too young, some said. She was 22, married, and according to family friends, not ready for motherhood. Elliot's father was never in the picture. Claire never even put a name on the birth certificate. For the first few years of Elliot's life, Claire moved around a lot. California, Nevada, Arizona. She worked odd jobs, waitressing, mostly sometimes disappearing for days at a time. Elliot was often left with neighbors or friends of friends, people who barely knew him, people who didn't ask questions. Then, when Elliot was 6, Claire stopped calling home. Margaret tried to reach her for months. She left voicemails, sent letters. To the last known address, even hired a private investigator. But Claire was gone. And one day, a social worker showed up at Margaret and Raymond's door with a small, silent boy clutching a backpack. That boy was Elliot. Margaret didn't even hesitate, said Helen Cortez, a neighbor who lived 3 houses down from the Brennans. I met Helen at her home, a tidy bungalow with flower boxes in every window. She was in her late 60s, sharp-eyed and direct. She just took him in, Helen continued. No questions, no complaints. Raymond wasn't thrilled. He was already dealing with health problems, but Margaret was determined. She said, that boy deserves a stable home, and she gave him one. By all accounts, Margaret treated Elliot well. She enrolled him in school, made sure he had clean clothes, helped him with homework. Raymond, though more distant, provided for him. They weren't wealthy, but they were stable. On paper, it should have been a good situation, but something about Elliot's life in that house never quite fit. I spoke with Mrs. Diane Fletcher, Elliot's third-grade teacher at Riverton Elementary. She was retired now, living in a small apartment on the edge of town, surrounded by books and photographs of students from over the years. When I showed her a picture of Elliot, her expression shifted. "Oh, I remember him," she said quietly. "Sweet boy, very polite, never caused any trouble." "But," I prompted. She hesitated. "But he was different, not in a bad way. Necessarily. Just off." "How so?" "He didn't play with the other kids much," she said. "During recess, he'd sit by himself, reading or just watching. And when he did interact, it was always very measured, very controlled, like he was thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever anyone else was saying." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "One time, a boy in class, Tommy Marsh, was being picked on by some older kids. Elliot saw it happening and walked right up to them. He didn't yell or fight. He just said something to them very calmly, and they stopped. Just like that." "What did he say?" "I don't know," Mrs. Fletcher admitted. "But Tommy told me later that Elliot had told the bullies something personal, something they didn't want anyone else to know. He said Elliot just knew things. I found that interesting. So I tracked down Tommy Marsh. Tommy was 20 now, working at an auto repair shop just outside Riverton. He was broad-shouldered, covered in grease stains, and clearly uncomfortable talking about Elliot. "Look, I was a kid," Tommy said, leaning against a workbench. "I don't remember much. But you remember Elliot." He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I remember him." "What was he like?" Tommy wiped his hands on a rag, stalling. "He was quiet, real quiet, but not shy, you know. It was like he was watching everyone, learning them." "Learning them?" "Yeah." Tommy's jaw tightened. "Like he was figuring out what made people tick, and once he knew, he could make them do whatever he wanted. Did he ever do that to you?" Tommy didn't answer right away. Then, "Once, in 5th grade, I forgot my lunch money and my mom was going to be pissed if she found out I lost it again. Elliot gave me $5. Just handed it to me, no questions. That sounds nice. It was until week later when he asked me to lie for him." "Lie about what?" "About where he was during lunch. Some kid said Elliot took his Game Boy and the teacher was asking around. Elliot told me to say he was with me the whole time. And I did, because I owed him." "Did he take the Game Boy?" Tommy looked. Tommy, me in the eye. "I don't know, but yeah, probably." That pattern came up again and again. Elliot wasn't violent, he wasn't loud, he didn't break rules openly, but he had a way of bending people, slowly, carefully, until they did what he wanted without even realizing it. At home, things were quieter. Too quiet. I obtained permission to review some of Elliot's school records and social services files. There were notes from a counselor who visited the house twice after Elliot's enrollment, standard procedure for kids in transitional custody. The counselor's notes were brief but telling. Child appears well cared for. Home is clean. Grandparents are attentive. Child is polite but emotionally distant. Does not display typical attachment behaviors. Recommend follow-up in 6 months. There was no follow-up. I spoke with Raymond Brennan's brother Carl Brennan, who lived 2 hours away in Portland. Carl was older than Raymond, quieter, more guarded. He agreed to meet me at a diner off the highway. Raymond loved that boy, Carl said, stirring his coffee slowly. But he didn't understand him. None of us did. What do you mean? Elliot was smart, real smart, but it wasn't just book. Smarts. He could read people. He'd sit at the dinner table, not saying a word, and you'd feel like he was taking notes on you. Did that bother you? Carl nodded. Yeah, it did. One time I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. You know what he said? What? He said, I want to be the person everyone listens to. Not a teacher, not a leader, just the person everyone listens to. Carl set down his mug. That's not what a normal kid says. Back at the house on Maple Ridge Road, things were structured. Margaret ran a tight ship. Dinner at 6, homework by 7, lights out by 9. Elliot followed the rules without complaint. But according to Helen Cortez, the neighbor, there were cracks. Margaret was firm, Helen said. She believed in discipline, in teaching respect. But sometimes I'd hear her voice through the walls, frustrated, tired. She'd say things like, Elliot, I asked you a simple question. Why can't you just answer me? What would he say? Nothing, that was the thing, he'd just go quiet, and that silence drove her crazy. Helen leaned forward. One time I was over there for coffee, and Margaret mentioned that Elliot had stopped eating vegetables. Just refused. She tried everything, reasoning, bargaining, even punishing him. Nothing worked. What happened? 2 weeks later, he started eating them again. No explanation. Margaret asked him why, and he just said, I changed my mind. Helen's eyes darkened. But the way he said it, it wasn't a kid. Giving in. It was like he'd made his point and decided to move on. The more I learned about Elliot's daily life, the more I realized he wasn't just quiet, he was controlled. Every action, every word, every reaction seemed calculated. But why? I found one more piece of the puzzle in an old yearbook. From Riverton Middle School. Elliot had just started 6th grade when the crime happened. In his class photo, he's standing in the back row, hands at his sides, no smile. But in the margin, someone had written in pen, he always knows what you're thinking. I showed the yearbook to Mrs. Fletcher, Elliot's former teacher. She stared at the note for a long time. Then she said something I'll never forget. That boy didn't need to be loud to be heard. He just needed you to believe he was harmless. And for years, everyone did. Until the night Margaret Brennan stopped breathing. September 3rd, 2018. The night everything changed. To understand what happened in that house, you have to understand what didn't happen, what wasn't said, what wasn't seen. Because for 3 hours that night, between 9 p.m. and midnight, nobody knows for sure what took place inside the Brennan home. What we do know is this. Margaret Brennan was alive at 9:07 p.m. By 12:17 a.m., she was dead. And in between, there was silence. The timeline starts earlier in the day. Margaret had spent the afternoon running errands, groceries, the pharmacy, a stop at the library to return books. Raymond had been home all day watching a documentary on World War II. Elliot had been at school. When Margaret got home around 4 p.m., she made dinner. Meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans. The same meal she made every Monday. Raymond told investigators that dinner was quiet. It always was, he said. Elliot didn't talk much at the table. Margaret would ask him about school, and he'd answer in a few words. That was normal for us. After dinner, Elliot went upstairs to do homework. Margaret cleaned the kitchen. Raymond stayed in the living room, his usual spot in the recliner. At 9:07 p.m., Margaret called her sister, Ruth Chandler, who lived in Eugene, about 90 minutes away. Ruth confirmed this during the investigation. They talked for 18 minutes about nothing in particular. Ruth's garden, Margaret's book club, the weather. She sounded fine, Ruth told me when I visited her at her assisted living facility. She was frail now, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea. Normal, maybe a little tired, but nothing out of the ordinary. Did she mention Elliot? Ruth nodded slowly. She did. She said he'd been quiet lately. More than usual. She was worried he wasn't adjusting well to middle school. Did she sound scared? No, Ruth said firmly. Not scared, just concerned, the way a grandmother is. The call ended at 9:25 p.m. That was the last time anyone heard Margaret's voice. What happened next is where the story fractures. According to Raymond, he stayed downstairs, watching television. He said he didn't hear anything unusual until just after midnight, a thud like something heavy falling. He called out to Margaret. No answer, so he climbed the stairs. But Detective Mallory found inconsistencies in Raymond's account almost immediately. During the initial interview, Raymond said he heard the sound just after midnight, but the 911 call was placed at 12:17 a.m., a full 17 minutes later. When Mallory asked him why it took so long to call, Raymond said he'd checked on Margaret first, then tried to wake her, then panicked. I didn't know what to do, Raymond said, his voice shaking. I've never seen anyone like that. I froze. Mallory pressed him. You froze for 17 minutes? Raymond didn't have an answer. Then there was Elliot's account. When police arrived, they found Elliot in his bedroom, sitting on his bed fully dressed. His shoes were tied. His backpack was on the floor beside him, zipped shut. Officer Kevin Strauss was the first to enter Elliot's room. I tracked him down at a coffee shop in Bend, where he'd moved after retiring from the force. I've been doing this job for 26 years, Strauss said, stirring sugar into his coffee. I've seen a lot of kids in bad situations, but Elliot, he was different. How? Most kids, when police show up in the middle of the night, they're scared, confused, crying. But Elliot just sat there, calm as anything. He looked up at me and said, Is she okay? What did you say? I asked him what he meant. He said, My grandma, I heard something fall. Strauss leaned back in his chair. So I asked him when he heard it, and he said, a while ago. How long is a while? That's what I asked. He just shrugged. Later, during formal questioning, Elliot said he'd been in his room all evening. He did his homework, read a book, then got ready for bed. He said he heard a noise around midnight, maybe a little before, but he didn't leave his room. Why not? Detective Mallory asked him. Elliot's answer, recorded on tape. Because Grandma doesn't like it when I bother her at night. That line stuck with me. It sounded reasonable on the surface, a child respecting boundaries, but it also felt rehearsed, convenient. I wanted to know more about what Elliot was doing in his room that night. So I went back to the police reports and found something interesting. Elliot's backpack. When officers searched his room, they found his school backpack packed and ready, even though it was a Monday night and he'd just come home from school that afternoon. Inside were textbooks, notebooks, pens, and a packed lunch. Why would a 12-year-old have his backpack ready? At midnight? I asked Raymond about it during one of our interviews. He was living in a small apartment now, alone, his health declining. He sat in a worn armchair, staring out the window as he spoke. Elliot was always prepared, Raymond said quietly. Margaret taught him to pack his bag the night. Every night. So he wouldn't forget anything. Even on Mondays, after he'd just come home from school. Raymond hesitated. I don't know. I never thought about it. But someone else did. Dr. Laura Finch, a forensic psychologist brought in by the defense during the trial, reviewed Elliot's behavior that night. I spoke with her over the phone and she didn't mince words. Packing a backpack isn't inherently suspicious, Dr. Finch said, but combined with everything else, the calmness, the lack of curiosity, the precise answers, it suggests a level of emotional detachment that's unusual. For a child his age. What does that mean? It means either Elliot was in shock, which is possible, or he knew exactly what had happened and was waiting for someone to find out. Then there's the question of the bedroom itself. Margaret's body was found in the master bedroom, on the floor beside the The room showed signs of a struggle. A lamp knocked over, a picture frame cracked. The bedspread pulled halfway off the mattress. But here's what didn't make sense. The door was closed. Raymond told police he found the door closed when he came upstairs. He had to open it to see inside. If Margaret had fallen or been attacked, why would the door be closed? Detective Mallory's theory was that Elliot closed it after the act, but the defense argued that Raymond could have closed it himself, either in shock or to preserve the scene. No one could prove it either way. And then there was the matter of the noise. Raymond said he heard a thud just after midnight, but Elliot said he heard a noise around midnight, maybe a little before. So which was it? I went back to the 911 call. Raymond's voice on the recording is shaky, frantic. My wife, she's not breathing, I don't know what happened. Please send someone. The dispatcher asks, when did you find her? Raymond's response, just now I heard something fall and I came upstairs and she was... He breaks down. But here's the problem. If Raymond heard the noise just now and immediately went upstairs, why did Elliot say he heard it? Earlier, I asked Officer Strauss about this discrepancy. We noticed it, he said, but kids don't have a great sense of time, especially under stress. We figured Elliot was just confused. Or, I said, he was lying. Strauss didn't disagree. The medical examiner's report added another layer of confusion. Margaret died from asphyxiation, pressure applied to her chest and throat. The report noted bruising consistent with prolonged compression, suggesting the attack lasted several minutes. But here's the thing. There were no defensive wounds on Margaret's hands or arms. No scratches, no bruises from trying to fight back. Dr. Alan Morris, the medical examiner, testified during the trial that this could mean one of two things. Either Margaret was unconscious when the pressure was applied, or she didn't perceive the attacker as a threat until it was too late. Think about it, Dr. Morris said on the stand. If someone you trusted, someone small, someone you loved, climbed on top of you, you might not fight back immediately. You might think they were just being affectionate. By the time you realized what was happening, it could already be too late. The prosecution used that testimony to paint Elliot as a calculating predator. The defense argued it was speculative and biased, but no one could explain the fibers. The fibers found under Margaret's fingernails matched Elliot's sweatshirt, a gray hoodie he'd been wearing that day. The defense tried to argue that the transfer could have happened earlier during normal contact, but the prosecution had an answer for that. The fibers were embedded deep, as if they'd been pulled during a struggle. I wanted to see the sweatshirt myself. I submitted a request to view the evidence, and after months of legal back and forth, I was granted access. The sweatshirt was plain, worn, exactly the kind a 12-year-old would own. But when I looked at the fabric under magnification, I saw it. Tiny tears along the shoulder seam, consistent with someone gripping it tightly. Margaret's last moments remain a mystery. Was she attacked? Suddenly, without warning? Or did she see it coming? Did she call out for help? Did she try to scream? And where was Raymond during those critical minutes? Where was Elliot? I interviewed the next-door neighbors, Paul and Jennifer Hastings. They were home that night watching a movie in their living room, which shared a wall with the Brennan's house. Did you hear anything unusual? I asked. Paul shook his head. Nothing. No yelling, no banging. Nothing. What about footsteps? Voices? Jennifer frowned. Now that you mention it, it was quiet. Too quiet. Usually we can hear Margaret moving. Around upstairs. Creaky floors, you know. But that night we didn't hear anything. What time was this? Between 9 and midnight. We went to bed around 11:30. Everything seemed normal. If everything was normal, what happened in those 3 hours of silence? That's the question no one could answer. Not Raymond, not Elliot, not the police. And maybe that's exactly what someone wanted. The investigation into Margaret Brennan's death lasted exactly 9 days. 9 days from the moment Raymond called 911 to the moment Elliot was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For a Case this serious, involving a child defendant, that's almost unheard of. Most homicide investigations take weeks, sometimes months. Evidence is gathered, witnesses are re-interviewed, alternative theories are explored. But in Riverton, Oregon, in September 2018, none of that happened. The pressure to close the case was immense, and Detective Vincent Mallory felt every ounce of it. Mallory was a fixture in Riverton. He'd worked there for 23 years, solving cases in a town where serious crime was rare. He was respected, trusted, and known for his gut instincts. But this case was different. I met Mallory at a bar on the outskirts of town, a dimly lit place where locals went to forget their troubles. He was older now, grayer, his face lined with years of sleepless nights. He agreed to talk to me on the condition that I wouldn't record our conversation. "I stand by the work we did," Mallory said, nursing a whiskey. "We followed the evidence, that's all any detective can do." "But the timeline," I pressed. 9 days. That's fast." He looked at me, hard. "You think I don't know that? You think I didn't feel the clock ticking? So why the rush?" Mallory set his glass down. "Because the community was falling apart. People were scared. They wanted answers, they wanted justice. And when you've got a dead grandmother and a kid who can't explain himself, the answers start to look pretty clear." But were they? Let's go back to the beginning of the investigation. On the morning of September 4th, less than 12 hours after Margaret's body was found, the Riverton Police Department held a press conference. Chief Robert Callahan stood at a podium, flanked by Mallory and 2 other officers. "We are treating this as a suspicious death," Callahan said, reading from a prepared statement. "We are interviewing all potential witnesses and gathering evidence. We ask the community to remain calm and to come forward with any information." But behind the scenes, the investigation was already narrowing. Mallory's first instinct was to focus on the household. In most cases, the killer is someone close to the victim, a family member, a friend, someone with access and opportunity. In the Brennan home, there were only 3 people: Margaret, Raymond, and Elliot. Margaret was the victim. That left 2 suspects. Raymond was questioned extensively. He was 74 years old, frail, with a history of heart problems and arthritis. The idea that he could overpower and suffocate his wife seemed unlikely, but not impossible. Mallory brought Raymond in for a second interview on September 5th. The session lasted 3 hours. Raymond's attorney, a local lawyer named Gerald Pine, sat beside him the entire time. I obtained a partial transcript of that interview through a public records request. Raymond's answers were shaky, contradictory at times, but consistent on one point. He didn't hurt his wife. "I loved Margaret," Raymond said, his voice breaking. "We've been married for 48 years. Why would I hurt her?" Mallory's response, according to the transcript: "People snap, Raymond, even people who love each other. Maybe she said something. Maybe you were tired. Maybe it was an accident." Raymond's attorney cut in. "My client has answered your questions. Unless you have evidence linking him to this crime, we're done here." Mallory didn't have evidence. Not against Raymond. So he turned to Elliot. Elliot was interviewed 3 times in the first week. The first interview took place the night of the crime, at the house with a social worker present. The second happened the following afternoon at the police station. The third was on September 7th, 4 days after Margaret's death. By then, Mallory had evidence he believed pointed directly at Elliot: the fibers under Margaret's fingernails, the timeline discrepancies, and Elliot's nervingly calm demeanor. But more than that, Mallory had a theory. "I've seen a lot of killers," Mallory told me at the bar, "and the ones who scare me the most aren't the ones who lose control. It's the ones who stay in control, the ones who think they're smarter than everyone else." "You think Elliot thought he was smarter than you?" Mallory nodded. "I know he did. You could see it in his eyes. Every time I asked him a question, he'd pause, just for a second, like he was deciding what version of the truth to give me. Maybe he was scared. Scared kids cry. Scared kids ask for their parents. Elliot didn't do any of that, he just waited. The third interview was the turning point. Mallory brought in a child psychologist, Dr. Emily Trent, to observe. Dr. Trent was supposed to ensure the interview was conducted appropriately, but Mallory had another reason for bringing her in. He wanted her professional opinion on Elliot's behavior. I tracked down Dr. Trent at her practice in Portland. She was hesitant to talk at first, citing confidentiality, but eventually agreed to speak in general terms. Elliot was unusual, Dr. Trent said carefully. Most children his age, especially in a high-stress situation like a police interview, exhibit clear signs of anxiety, fidgeting, avoidance, emotional outbursts. Elliot exhibited none of that. What did he exhibit? Control. He answered questions thoughtfully, made eye contact, showed appropriate concern when discussing his grandmother, but it felt rehearsed, like he was performing the role of a grieving child rather than actually being one. Did you tell Detective Mallory that? She hesitated. I told him Elliot's behavior was atypical. I also told him that atypical doesn't mean guilty, but I'm not sure he heard the second part. During that third interview, Mallory asked Elliot a question that would later become central to the prosecution's case. Elliot, Mallory said, leaning forward, did you love your grandmother? Elliot paused. Then he said, yes. Did she love you? Yes. Did she ever make you angry? Another pause. Sometimes. Why? Elliot looked down at his hands. Because she made me do things I didn't want to do. Like what? Homework, chores, going to bed early. Mallory pressed further. Did you ever think about hurting her? Elliot's attorney, a different lawyer now, court-appointed named Monica Briggs, interrupted. Detective, he's 12 years old. That's an inappropriate question. But Elliot answered anyway. No, he said quietly. I never thought about hurting her. Mallory didn't believe him, and neither did the district attorney. Sharon Vance was the lead prosecutor assigned to the case. She was in her mid-40s, ambitious with a reputation for winning difficult cases. When I reached out to her for an interview, she declined. But I found recordings of her press conferences and trial arguments. On September 10th, 1 week after Margaret's death, Vance held a press conference. Based on the evidence gathered by the Riverton Police Department, Vance said, we believe we have identified the person responsible for Margaret Brennan's death. We are pursuing charges and will ensure justice is served. She didn't name Elliot. She didn't have to. By then, the entire town knew. The forensic evidence was thin, but Vance built her case on something more persuasive: behavior. She argued that Elliot's calmness wasn't shock. It was calculation. She argued that the fibers under Margaret's fingernails weren't from innocent contact. They were from a struggle. She argued that Elliot's admission of resentment wasn't normal childhood frustration. It was motive. And she argued that a 12-year-old could commit murder if that 12-year-old was clever enough, cold enough, and angry enough. The defense tried to push back. Monica Briggs, Elliot's attorney, was overworked and underfunded. She had 3 other cases that month, including 2 felonies. She did her best, but she was outmatched. Briggs filed a motion to suppress Elliot's interviews, arguing that he'd been questioned without adequate legal representation. The motion was denied. She requested a psychological evaluation of Elliot to determine his mental state. The court granted it, but the psychologist's report was inconclusive. Elliot showed no signs of psychosis, no developmental disorders, no clear indicators of violent tendencies, but he also showed limited emotional affect and difficulty forming attachments, traits that could be interpreted multiple ways. Briggs tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial, that the timeline didn't add up, that there were too many unanswered questions. But Vance had something Briggs didn't: momentum. The community wanted someone to blame. The media wanted a story. And Elliot, quiet, strange, impossible to read, made an easy target. On September 12th, 9 days after Margaret's death, Elliot Brennan was formally arrested and charged with first-degree murder. He was 12 years old. The arrest took place early in the morning. Officers arrived at the temporary foster home where Elliot had been staying since the night of the crime. He was still in his pajamas when they put him in handcuffs. According to the arresting officer, Lieutenant Sarah Donnelly, Elliot didn't resist. He didn't cry. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at her and said, "Okay." I spoke with Lieutenant Donnelly by phone. She was retired now, living in Florida, trying to forget the cases that haunted her. "I've arrested a lot of people," Donnelly said. "Adults, kids, all kinds. But Elliot, I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like he'd been expecting it, like he'd already figured out how the whole thing was going to play out. Do you think he did it?" She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I think the system decided he did. And once that happens, it's almost impossible to turn back." The speed of the investigation troubled a lot of people, not just the defense, but outside observers, legal experts, even some members of the community. Professor Daniel Hargrove, a criminal justice professor at the University of Oregon, reviewed the case file at my request. His assessment was blunt. "This investigation was rushed," Hargrove said. "Critical evidence was overlooked. Alternative suspects were dismissed too quickly, and the interrogation of a minor was handled poorly. This case should have taken months, not days." "Why didn't it?" "Because," Hargrove said, "sometimes the system values closure more than it values truth. But there was one piece of evidence that Mallory found in those 9 days that he believed sealed Elliot's fate. A recording. Not the interview tapes. Something else. Something that, according to Mallory, proved Elliot knew exactly what he was doing. And when I finally heard it, I understood why he rushed to judgment. The trial of Elliot Brennan began on February 4, 2019, 5 months after his arrest. 5 months of legal arguments, motions, and delays. 5 months of a 12-year-old boy sitting in a juvenile detention center, waiting. The courtroom was packed from day one, reporters lined the back rows, cameras positioned outside for the midday updates. Protesters gathered on the courthouse steps, some demanding justice for Margaret, others demanding mercy for a child. Inside, every seat was filled. Spectators who couldn't get in watched from overflow rooms on closed-circuit monitors. This wasn't just a trial, it was a spectacle. And at the center of it all, in a chair too big for his small frame, sat Elliot Brennan. He wore a button-down shirt and khaki pants, clothes his court-appointed guardian had picked out to make him look like a child, not a criminal. His hands rested on the table in front of him, folded neatly. His face was blank. He didn't cry, he didn't fidget. He didn't look around nervously the way most 12-year-olds would in a room full of strangers deciding their fate. He just sat there. Judge Judith Carver presided. She was 63, a no-nonsense jurist with a reputation for fairness and efficiency. She'd handled juvenile cases before, but nothing like this. Before the trial even started, Carver made a ruling that would define everything that followed. Elliot would be tried as an adult. The prosecution had filed a motion arguing that the severity of the crime and the evidence of premeditation warranted adult charges. The defense fought back, arguing that Elliot was still a child, incapable of the level of intent required for first-degree murder. Carver sided with the prosecution. "While I do not take this decision lightly," Carver said during the hearing, "the evidence suggests a level of deliberation and control inconsistent with impulsive juvenile behavior. This court finds that the interests of justice are best served by proceeding under adult criminal statutes." That decision meant Elliot could be sentenced to life in prison without parole. It meant the stakes were as high as they could possibly be, and it meant the trial would be brutal. Prosecutor Sharon Vance opened with a statement that set the tone for everything that followed. She stood in front of the jury, 12 men and women from Riverton and the surrounding area, and spoke with quiet, controlled intensity. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vance began, "this is a case about a boy who made a choice, not a mistake, not an accident. A choice. She paused, letting the words settle. On the night of September 3rd, 2018, Margaret Brennan, a woman who opened her home and her heart to her grandson, was murdered in her own bedroom. She was 72 years old. She was kind. She was generous. And she trusted the person who killed her. Vance gestured toward Elliot. That person is sitting right there. Elliot Brennan, 12 years old, small, quiet, polite, the kind of child you'd never suspect, and that's exactly why he got away with it for as long as he did. The defense attorney, Monica Briggs, objected. Your Honor, counsel is arguing facts not yet in evidence. Judge Carver sustained the objection, but the damage was done. The jury was already looking at Elliot differently. Vance continued. Over the course of this trial, you will hear evidence that Elliot Brennan resented his grandmother. You will hear that he admitted to feeling anger toward her. You will hear testimony about his unusual behavior, his calmness, his control, his ability to manipulate those around him. She walked closer to the jury box. And you will hear about the physical evidence. Fibers from Elliot's clothing found under Margaret's fingernails. A timeline that doesn't add up. A boy who packed his school bag at midnight and sat in his room waiting, while his grandmother lay dying just down the hall. Vance's voice dropped. Margaret Brennan died slowly. She died in pain, and she died alone, because the one person who could have helped her, the one person she loved and cared for, chose to do nothing. She let that hang in the air. This is not a tragedy. This is a crime, and Elliot Brennan is responsible. When Vance sat down, the courtroom was silent. Monica Briggs stood for the defense. Briggs was in her late 30s, a public defender who'd been practicing for just over a decade. She was smart, passionate, but visibly exhausted. She'd been assigned this case with less than 2 months to prepare, and she was going up against one of the best prosecutors in the state. Briggs didn't have much to work with, but she tried. Ladies and gentlemen, Briggs said, her voice steady, the prosecution wants you to believe that Elliot Brennan is a monster, a cold-blooded killer, a child so evil that he deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison. She shook her head. But that's not what the evidence shows. What the evidence shows is a scared, confused boy who lost his grandmother in a tragic and unexplained event. A boy who has been demonized, scrutinized, and judged before he ever had a chance to tell his side of the story. Briggs gestured toward Elliot. Elliot didn't kill Margaret Brennan. The prosecution has no murder weapon, no confession, no witness who saw him commit this crime. What they have is fiber evidence that can be explained by normal, everyday contact. What they have is a timeline that raises more questions than it answers. And what they have is a narrative built on assumptions, not facts. She paused. Elliot is different. I won't deny that. He's quiet. He's reserved. He processes emotion differently than other children his age. But being different is not a crime, and it is not evidence of guilt. Briggs looked at the jury. Margaret Brennan's death is a tragedy, but convicting an innocent child will not bring her back, and it will not serve justice. It was a strong opening, but I could see it in the jurors' faces. They weren't convinced. The prosecution's case began with the medical examiner. Dr. Alan Morris took the stand and walked the jury through the autopsy findings. He explained that Margaret died from asphyxiation, pressure applied to her chest and throat over a sustained period. How long would this have taken? Vance asked. Several minutes, Dr. Morris said. Possibly as many as 5 or 6. And during that time, would the victim have been conscious? Likely, yes. At least initially. Vance let that sink in. Then she asked, Doctor, in your professional opinion, how much physical strength would it take to asphyxiate someone in this manner? Dr. Morris considered the question. Not as much as you might think. It's not about strength. It's about pressure and persistence. A child could do it, especially if the victim was caught off guard or unable to defend themselves. The defense cross-examined, but there wasn't much Briggs could do. The autopsy was clear. Margaret had been suffocated. The only question was by whom. Next came Detective Vincent Mallory. Mallory took the stand with confidence. He'd testified in dozens of trials, and he knew how to present himself. Calm, professional, credible. Vance walked him through the investigation step by step. The 911 call, the scene, the interviews, the evidence. When she got to the fibers, Vance held up a photograph of Margaret's hand, magnified to show the tiny strands beneath her. Fingernails? Detective Mallory, Vance said, can you explain the significance of these fibers? Yes, Mallory said. We sent them to the state crime lab for analysis. The fibers matched a sweatshirt belonging to Elliot Brennan, the same sweatshirt he was wearing the night his grandmother died. And how do you believe those fibers got there? Mallory looked at the jury. I believe they got there during a struggle. Margaret Brennan grabbed at her attacker, trying to push them off, and in doing so, she pulled fibers from his clothing. Briggs objected. Speculation, Your Honor. Overruled, Judge Carver said. The witness is offering his professional opinion based on the evidence. Mallory continued. The fibers were embedded deep, consistent with forceful contact. They weren't transferred through casual touch. They were transferred during an act of violence. It was damning testimony. And it got worse. Vance introduced the recording. Detective Mallory, she said, during your investigation, did you obtain any audio recordings relevant to this case? Yes, Mallory said. We obtained a voicemail left on Margaret Brennan's phone approximately 3 weeks before her death. And who left that voicemail? Elliot Brennan. The courtroom stirred. This was new. The defense hadn't been given access to this recording until the week before trial, a fact Briggs had protested repeatedly. Vance asked permission to play the recording. Judge Carver allowed it. The audio was scratchy, recorded on an old answering machine, but the voice was unmistakable. It was Elliot. Grandma, the voice said, calm and measured. I need you to pick me up from school early today. I don't feel good. If you don't, I'm going to walk home by myself. And if something happens to me, it'll be your fault. The recording ended. The courtroom was silent. Vance looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the voice of a child who understands manipulation, who understands guilt, who knows exactly what to say to get what he wants. Briggs shot to her feet. Objection. That voicemail has nothing to do with the night of the crime. The prosecution is trying to paint my client as manipulative without any evidentiary basis. Your Honor, Vance said smoothly, this recording establishes a pattern of behavior. It shows the defendant's mindset and his relationship with the victim. Judge. Carver thought for a moment. Overruled. The recording is relevant to establishing the defendant's state of mind. Proceed. Briggs sat back down, her jaw tight. The rest of the day was a parade of witnesses. Neighbors who said Elliot was odd. Teachers who said he was too smart for his own good. A classmate who claimed Elliot once said, "People believe what you want them to believe if you say it the right way." Each testimony built on the last, constructing an image of Elliot as cold, calculating, dangerous. And through it all, Elliot sat motionless. He didn't react to the testimony. He didn't look at the witnesses. He didn't even look at his attorney. He just stared straight ahead, his hands folded, his face blank. At the end of the first week, I spoke with one of the jurors' family members, off the record, outside the courthouse. "What do people think so far?" I asked. The man looked around, then leaned in. "Honestly, most people think he did it. That recording, it creeped everyone out." "What about the defense?" He shrugged. "She's trying. But what can she do? The kid won't help himself. He just sits there like a statue. It's unnerving." And that was the problem. Elliot's silence, his calmness, his refusal to show emotion. It was being used against him. The prosecution framed it as evidence of guilt. The defense tried to frame it as trauma. But the truth was, nobody really knew what Elliot was thinking. Nobody except Elliot. And he wasn't talking. The eye. Prosecution rested after 2 weeks of testimony. They'd built a case brick by brick. The fibers, the timeline, the voicemail, the witnesses. Every piece pointed toward one conclusion, that Elliot Brennan, at 12 years old, had killed his grandmother and tried to get away with it. But the defense knew something the prosecution didn't want to admit. Margaret Brennan wasn't a saint, and Elliot Brennan wasn't a monster. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Monica Briggs opened her case by calling character witnesses, people who knew Elliot, who'd seen him in moments the prosecution had ignored. The first was Mrs. Ava Lindholm, a retired schoolteacher who'd volunteered at Riverton Elementary for over 20 years. Mrs. Lindholm was in her 70s, soft-spoken, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She walked slowly to the witness stand, leaning on a cane, and took her seat with a quiet dignity. Briggs approached her gently. "Mrs. Lindholm, how do you know Elliot Brennan?" "I was a reading tutor at his elementary school," Mrs. Lindholm said. "I worked with him twice a week for about 1.5 years. What was he like?" Mrs. Lindholm smiled faintly. "He was a lovely boy, very bright, very curious. He loved books, mystery novels especially. He'd finish one and immediately ask for another." "Did he ever display violent behavior?" "Never. Not once." Briggs nodded. "Did you ever see Elliot interact with his grandmother?" "Yes, Margaret would pick him up from school sometimes. I saw them together on several occasions." "And how would you describe their relationship?" Mrs. Lindholm hesitated. "It was complicated." Briggs leaned in. "What do you mean by complicated?" "Margaret loved him. I have no doubt about that. But she was strict, very strict. She had rules for everything. How Elliot should dress, how he should speak, what he could and couldn't do. And Elliot, he followed those rules. But I could tell it wore on him." "Did he ever complain?" "Not directly. But once after Margaret had scolded him in front of me for forgetting his jacket, Elliot looked at me and said, 'She means well.' The way he said it, it broke my heart. Like he was trying to convince himself." Prosecutor Vance cross-examined. "Mrs. Lindholm," Vance said, her tone sharp, "you said Margaret was strict. Would you say she was abusive?" "No," Mrs. Lindholm said firmly. "She wasn't abusive. She was just old-fashioned, demanding." "So Elliot had no reason to resent her?" Mrs. Lindholm frowned. "I didn't say that. I think he struggled with the rules. But struggling doesn't mean he wanted to hurt her," Vance pressed. "But you also said their relationship was complicated. Complicated enough that a child might feel trapped?" "Objection," Briggs said. "Leading. Sustained." Vance smiled thinly. No further questions. The next witness was more unexpected. Martin Crowley, a local firefighter, took the stand. Crowley was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with a no-nonsense demeanor. He'd lived in Riverton his entire life and had known the Brennan family for years. Briggs asked him how he knew Elliot. "I met him about 1 year before Margaret died," Crowley said. "We were doing a fire safety demonstration at the elementary school, and afterward, Elliot came. Up to me with all these questions, smart questions. How fires spread, how we contained them, how we made decisions under pressure. Kid was sharp." "Did you stay in touch?" "Yeah, he'd see me around town and wave. We'd chat for a few minutes here and there. Good kid." Briggs asked, "Did Elliot ever strike you as dangerous?" Crowley laughed, short and humorless. "Dangerous? No. Quiet, sure, but dangerous, not even close." "Did he ever mention his grandmother?" Crowley's expression shifted. "Once. We were at the hardware store and I saw him there with Margaret. She was, let's just say she was, very particular about what he could touch. Kept telling him to stand still, don't wander off, don't ask questions. After she walked away to look at something, I asked him if he was okay. He said, 'I'm fine. She just worries a lot.'" "And did you believe him?" Crowley looked directly at the jury. "I believed he was trying to protect her, even back then. But the most powerful testimony came from someone no one expected, Daniel Mora, 13 years old, one of Elliot's classmates. Daniel was small for his age, with messy, dark hair and nervous energy. He kept his hands in his lap as he sat in the witness box, glancing occasionally at Elliot. Briggs asked him how he knew Elliot. "We had a few classes together," Daniel said quietly. "Math, science, lunch. Were you friends?" Daniel hesitated. "Not really. Elliot didn't have a lot of friends. But we talked sometimes." "What did you talk about?" "Random stuff, homework, video games, nothing serious." Briggs softened her voice. "Daniel, I want to ask you about something that happened last year. Can you tell the court what you told me during our pre-trial interview?" Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, I got into some trouble. There were these older kids who kept messing with me, shoving me in the hallway, taking my stuff, calling me names. I didn't tell anyone because I thought it would just get worse." "What happened?" "One day, they cornered me after school. I thought they were going to beat me up. But then Elliot showed up." The courtroom was silent. "What did Elliot do?" Briggs asked. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "He didn't fight them. He just walked up and started talking. I don't know what he said, but whatever it was, it worked. They left me alone after that. Never bothered me again." "Did Elliot ever tell you what he said to them?" "No, I asked him, but he just said, 'Don't worry about it.'" Briggs paused. "Daniel, based on your experience with Elliot, do you think he's capable of hurting someone?" Daniel looked at Elliot for the first time. "No, I don't. He helped me when nobody else did. I don't care what anyone says, he's not a bad person." Vance's cross-examination was brief but pointed. "Daniel," Vance said, "you said Elliot talked to those older kids and they stopped bothering you. But you don't know what he said, correct?" "Correct. So for all you know, he could have threatened them, blackmailed them, used information against them to make them stop." "Objection," Briggs said. "Speculation. Sustained." But Vance had made her point. Even a good deed could be twisted into something sinister. The defense also called Raymond Brennan to the stand. Raymond looked older than his 74 years. His face was gaunt, his movements slow. He wore a suit that hung loose on his shrinking frame. Briggs handled him carefully. "Mr. Brennan, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you about your relationship with Elliot." Raymond nodded. "He's my grandson. I love him." "Did you ever see Elliot act violently toward your wife?" "No, never." "Did you ever see him argue with her?" Raymond hesitated. "They disagreed sometimes. Margaret had her ways, and Elliot, he didn't always understand them. But they never fought. Not like you're thinking." "Mr. Brennan, on the night of September 3rd, where were you?" "Downstairs, watching TV." "And you didn't hear anything unusual until after midnight?" "That's right." Briggs asked the question she knew would hurt. "Do you believe Elliot killed your wife?" Raymond's eyes filled with tears. He looked across the courtroom at Elliot, who stared back with that same unreadable expression. "I don't know," Raymond whispered. "I want to say no. I want to believe he didn't, but I don't know." It was devastating. Vance didn't even cross-examine. She didn't need to. But the most unexpected testimony came near the end of the week. Woman named Grace Harmon took the stand. Grace was in her mid-30s, a social worker who lived 2 towns over. She'd never met Elliot before the trial, but she had something important to say. Briggs asked, "Ms. Harmon, can you tell the court why you're here today?" Grace took a breath. 3 years ago, my car broke down on a back road outside Riverton. It was late and my phone was dead. I was stranded. Then this kid rode up on a bike. Couldn't have been more than 9 or 10. He asked if I was okay. What did you do? I told him I needed help. He rode to the nearest house and called a tow truck for me. Then he waited with me until it arrived. It was freezing that night and he gave me his jacket." Briggs leaned forward. "Did you ever learn that child's name?" Grace nodded. "Not until I saw his picture in the news last year. It was Elliot Brennan." The courtroom murmured. "Ms. Harmon," Briggs said, Why didn't you come forward sooner? Because I didn't know he was the same kid until recently. But when I saw what was happening, this trial, the way people were talking about him, I couldn't stay silent. That boy saved me that night. He didn't have to, but he did. Vance tried. Vance. To undermine the testimony on cross. Ms. Harmon, you're asking this jury to believe that one act of kindness 3 years ago proves Elliot Brennan is innocent? No, Grace said firmly. I'm asking them to remember that he's a human being, not a monster. The defense rested the next day, and as trial moved toward closing arguments, one thing was clear. Elliot Brennan was a puzzle no one could solve. Some saw a boy capable of terrible things. Others saw a boy who'd been misjudged, misunderstood, and failed by the adults around him. But nobody could say for certain what the truth was. And maybe that was exactly what someone wanted. If you want to understand what happened the night Margaret Brennan died, you have to understand the house she lived in. Not the physical structure, though that mattered too, but the home, the unspoken rules, the secrets buried beneath years of routine and silence. Because the Brennan household wasn't just where a crime took place, it was where something had been breaking for a long, long time. I started digging into the family history months into my investigation. Court records, interviews, old newspaper clippings. What I found painted a picture, far more complicated than the prosecution had presented. Margaret and Raymond Brennan had been married for 48 years. By all public accounts, they were a stable, respectable couple. Raymond worked for the county as a civil engineer until he retired. Margaret spent decades as a librarian at Riverton Public Library. They had one child, Claire Brennan. Claire was born in 1974. By the time she was a teenager, neighbors remember her as rebellious, restless, eager to escape the confines of small-town life. She clashed with her mother constantly. I found a former classmate of Claire's, Nina Pelletier, who still lived in Riverton. We met at a coffee shop downtown. Claire was smart, Nina said, stirring her latte slowly. But she hated it here, hated the rules, hated the expectations. Margaret wanted her to go to college, get a respectable job, settle down. Claire wanted the opposite. What did she want? Nina shrugged. Freedom, I guess. She used to talk about leaving, seeing the world, doing something that mattered. But she never had a plan. She just ran. Claire left Riverton 2 weeks after graduating high school. She was 18. She didn't tell her parents where she was going. For the next few years, Margaret and Raymond heard from her sporadically. A phone call here, a postcard there. She was in Los Angeles, then Portland, then Reno. She worked odd jobs, dated men her parents never met, and refused to come home. Then, in 1996, Claire called with news. She was pregnant. Margaret begged her to come back to Riverton. Claire refused. She said she had it under control. She said she didn't need help. But that wasn't true. Elliot was born in February 1997. Claire was 22, single, and living in a one-bedroom apartment in Fresno, California. According to records I found through a private investigator, Claire struggled from the start. She worked as a waitress, sometimes 2 shifts a day, leaving Elliot with neighbors or in makeshift daycare situations. By the time Elliot was 3, Claire was moving constantly. Sacramento, Bakersfield, Stockton. She told people she was chasing opportunities. But the truth was simpler. She was running from debt, bad relationships, and the responsibilities she couldn't handle. Margaret tried to stay in touch. She sent money when she could. She called every few weeks. But Claire kept her at arm's length. She didn't want her mother's help, said Father Antonio Reyes, a priest who knew the family during that time. I met him at St. Michael's Church in Riverton, a small brick building where Margaret had attended Mass for decades. Margaret confided in me, Father Reyes said. She was heartbroken. She wanted to be part of her grandson's life, but Claire wouldn't allow it. Margaret blamed herself. She thought she'd been too strict, too controlling. She thought that's why Claire ran. Was she? I asked. Too controlling? Father Reyes chose his words carefully. Margaret had very clear ideas about how life should be lived, and she expected the people she loved to follow those ideas. Sometimes that came from a place of love, sometimes it came from fear. By the time Elliot was 6, Claire had stopped answering Margaret's calls altogether. Then, in late 2003, a social worker from Fresno contacted Margaret and Raymond. Claire had abandoned Elliot. She'd left him with a neighbor, a woman Claire barely knew, and disappeared. The neighbor waited 3 days before calling authorities. When social services investigated, they found that Claire had been evicted from her apartment, had outstanding warrants for unpaid fines, and had no known address. Elliot was placed in temporary foster care. Margaret and Raymond drove to California immediately. Within 2 weeks, they'd filed for emergency custody. Within 2 months, Elliot was living with them in Riverton. Claire never came back for him. Raymond told me this part of the story during one of our last interviews. He was sitting in his small apartment, staring out the window, his voice flat with exhaustion. Margaret thought bringing Elliot home would fix things, Raymond said. She thought if she could raise him right, give him structure, give him love, maybe it would make up for what happened with Claire. Did it? Raymond didn't answer right away. Then, I don't know. I think she tried. I think she tried so hard it broke her. Elliot arrived in Riverton as a quiet, withdrawn 7-year-old. He didn't talk much. He didn't cry. He didn't ask about his mother. Margaret enrolled him in school, took him to church, made sure he had everything he needed. But according to those who knew the family, the relationship was always strained. Margaret loved him, said Helen Cortez, the neighbor, but she didn't know how to reach him, and I think that scared her. Helen told me about the routines Margaret enforced. Wake up at 6:30 a.m., breakfast by 7, school by 8, homework immediately after school, dinner at 6, lights out by 9. No exceptions. She thought structure would help him feel safe, Helen said. But I think it just made him feel trapped. There were small rebellions. Elliot would forget to do a chore. He'd leave his homework until the last minute. He'd go silent when Margaret asked him questions. She'd get so frustrated, Helen said. I heard her once through the wall almost shouting, "Why won't you just talk to me?" Raymond admitted he wasn't much help. I didn't know what to do with him, Raymond said. I was 70 years old when he came to live with us. I was tired, my health was failing, and Elliot, he was like a stranger in the house. I tried to connect with him, but it never felt natural. Did you love him? I asked. Raymond's voice cracked. I wanted to. But the most telling insight into the Brennan household came from something I found buried in Margaret's belongings. After her death, Raymond had boxed up most of her personal items and stored them in the basement. I asked if I could look through them. He agreed, though he seemed reluctant. Among the boxes I found journals. Margaret had kept journals for years, small leather-bound notebooks where she wrote about her day, her thoughts, her prayers. Most entries were mundane, but some stood out. One entry dated April 2015. Elliot is getting harder to understand. He's so intelligent, but he uses it in ways that unsettle me. Today, I asked him why he didn't finish his math homework. He looked at me and said, because I already know how to do it. Why waste time proving it to someone else? I told him that's not how life works. He just stared at me. Sometimes I feel like he's testing me, like he's waiting for me to fail. Another entry, from July 2017. Raymond says I'm too hard on Elliot. Maybe I am. But I see so much of Claire in him. The stubbornness, the distance, the need to control everything. I can't lose him the way I lost her. I won't. And then, just 2 weeks before her death, this. I don't know what to do anymore. Elliot barely speaks to me. When he does, it feels rehearsed, like he's saying what I want to hear, not what he actually feels. I asked him if he was happy. He said yes. But I didn't believe him. I don't think he believes it either. Reading those entries, I realized something. Margaret wasn't just strict. She was terrified. Terrified of losing Elliot the way she'd lost Claire. Terrified of failing him. terrified that no matter what she did, it wouldn't be enough. And maybe Elliot knew that. Maybe he used it. I spoke with Dr. Linda Graves, a family therapist who'd worked with foster and adoptive families for over 20 years. I showed her excerpts from Margaret's journals and asked for her professional assessment. "This is classic role reversal," Dr. Graves said. Margaret was supposed to be the authority figure, but emotionally, she'd placed herself in a position of dependence. She needed Elliot to validate her, to prove that she was a good guardian, a good grandmother. And when he didn't give her that validation, it destabilized her. Could Elliot have sensed that? Absolutely. Children are incredibly perceptive, especially children who've experienced instability. They learn to read the adults around them, to figure out what makes them tick. And once they know, they can exploit it, not out of malice necessarily, but out of survival. So, you're saying Elliot manipulated her? Dr. Graves hesitated. I'm saying he may have learned that withholding affection or approval was a way to assert control in a situation where he otherwise had none. Whether that's manipulation or self-preservation, that's the question. The house itself told a story, too. I walked through it months after the crime, after Raymond had moved out and the property sat empty, waiting to be sold. The prosecutor's office allowed me access as part of my research. It was a 2-story colonial, modest but well-kept. The living room was neat, everything in its place. The kitchen was spotless. Upstairs, Margaret and Raymond's bedroom was at the end of the hall. Elliot's room was on the opposite side. Standing in that hallway, I realized how far apart they were. Elliot's room was small, sparse. A bed, a desk, a bookshelf. No posters, no decorations. The walls were blank. It felt like a room someone was just passing through. In the closet, I found something strange. A stack of notebooks, hidden beneath a pile of old clothes. They were filled with Elliot's handwriting, neat, precise. Most of it was schoolwork, but some pages were different. Lists of people's names. Notes beside each one. Likes to be agreed with. Afraid of looking weak. Believes anything if you say it confidently. It was like he was cataloging them, studying them. I took photos of those pages and later showed them to Dr. Graves. She stared at them for a long time. Then she said, "This is what sociopathy looks like in its early stages." Or what? Or it's what survival looks like when you're a child trying to navigate a world where no one really understands you. The Brennan house wasn't a home. It was a battlefield. Silent, controlled, but a battlefield. Nonetheless. And on the night of September 3rd, 2018, something in that house finally broke. The trial painted a clear picture. A boy, a motive, physical evidence, and a timeline that pointed toward guilt. But trials don't include everything. Some evidence gets excluded. Some witnesses never take stand. Some facts, critical facts, get buried in procedural motions, dismissed as irrelevant, or simply overlooked in the rush to judgment. I started finding those pieces 6 months into my investigation, and the more I found, the more I realized the case against Elliot Brennan wasn't as airtight as everyone believed. It started with a phone call. I was in my apartment in Portland, sifting through boxes of documents I'd requested from the Riverton Police Department, when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. "Jordan Hayes?" A woman's voice said. "Yes. Who's this?" "My name is Angela Frost. I was a paralegal for the public defender's office during Elliot Brennan's trial. I heard you were looking into the case." I sat up. "I am. What can I do for you?" There was a long pause. Then, "There's something you need to see." We met 2 days later at a diner in Salem, halfway between Portland and Riverton. Angela was in her early 50s, sharp-eyed, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked like someone who didn't sleep much. She slid a manila folder across the table. "What's this?" I asked. "Evidence the jury never saw," she said. "Evidence Monica Briggs. Tried to introduce, but the judge wouldn't allow it." I opened the folder. Inside were copies of police reports, witness statements, and photographs. The first document was a police report filed on August 29, 2018, 5 days before Margaret's death. It was a noise complaint. A neighbor, Thomas Ridley, who lived 2 houses down from the Brennans, had called the police around 11 p.m. He reported hearing raised voices and a loud crash coming from the Brennan home. An officer responded, spoke briefly with Raymond at the door. Raymond said everything was fine, that he'd dropped a dish while cleaning the kitchen. The officer noted no signs of distress and closed the call. "Why didn't this come up at trial?" I asked. Angela leaned back. "Briggs tried. She argued it showed there was tension in the house beyond just Elliot and Margaret, that maybe Raymond was involved, or that something else was going on. But the judge ruled it was too speculative. It never made it to the jury." I flipped to the next document, a statement from a school counselor, Ms. Patricia Voss. Ms. Voss had met with Elliot twice in the weeks leading up to Margaret's death. She'd noted in her report that Elliot seemed withdrawn and anxious, and that he'd mentioned feeling pressure at home. When she asked him to elaborate, he said, "My grandma wants me to be perfect, but I don't think I can be." Ms. Voss had flagged this as a potential issue and planned to follow up. But before she could, Margaret was dead. I looked up at Angela. "The prosecution never mentioned this." "Because it didn't fit their narrative," Angela said. "They wanted Elliot to be a cold, calculating killer. A kid expressing anxiety and pressure. That makes him sympathetic. They buried it." I kept reading. The next page was a witness statement from Derek Pullman, a delivery driver for a local grocery service. On the afternoon of September 3rd, the day Margaret died, Derek had delivered groceries to the Brennan home around 4:30 p.m. He remembered the visit clearly because Margaret had seemed upset. In his statement, Derek said, "She answered the door, but she looked distracted. I asked if everything was okay, and she said, 'It's fine, just a long day.' But her hands were shaking when she signed for the delivery. I remember thinking something was off." Derek also noted that he saw someone else in the house through the window in the living room. He couldn't identify who it was, but he was certain it wasn't Elliot or Raymond. "It was someone taller," Derek's statement read. "An adult, I think, but I only saw them for a second." I looked at Angela, stunned. "Someone else was in the house that day?" "Maybe," Angela said. "Or maybe Derek saw a shadow, a reflection, who knows. But Briggs wanted to put him on the stand. The prosecution fought it, said it was speculative and irrelevant. The judge agreed." "Why didn't Briggs fight harder?" Angela sighed. "Because she was drowning. She had 4 other cases, a fraction of the resources the DA had, and a client who wouldn't help himself. She did what she could, but it wasn't enough." I kept digging through the folder. The next document was the most disturbing. It was a handwritten note, found in Margaret's bedroom after her death, tucked inside a book on her nightstand. The note was brief, written in Margaret's handwriting. "I can't keep doing this. I don't know who to trust anymore." The note was dated August 31st, 2018, 3 days before she died. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. "We don't know," Angela said. "Briggs tried to introduce it as evidence that Margaret was under some kind of stress, that maybe there was more going on in that house than anyone realized. But the prosecution argued it was vague and could mean anything. The judge excluded it." I stared at the note. Who didn't she trust? Elliot, Raymond, someone else? Angela shrugged. "That's the question, isn't it?" Over the next few weeks, I tracked down the people whose names appeared in that folder. I started with Derek Pullman. Derek was in his late 20s now, working at a warehouse in Eugene. I met him during his lunch break, sitting on a loading dock in the sun. "I remember that delivery," Derek said, unwrapping a sandwich. "It stuck with me because of what happened a few days later. When I heard she was dead, I don't know. I thought maybe I should have said something." "About what?" "About how she seemed. She wasn't just upset, she was scared." I could see it in her eyes. And the person you saw in the house? Derek frowned. I told the police about that, but they didn't seem to care. They kept asking me if I saw Elliot, if he seemed aggressive, if he said anything weird. When I told them I didn't see him at all, they kind of lost interest. Did you get a good look at the person you did see? Derek shook his head. Not really. Like I said, it was just a glimpse. Tall, average build. Could have been a man or a woman. Could have been Raymond, I guess, but I don't think so. Why not? Because Raymond was upstairs. I heard him. Coughing. He had this real distinct cough. It was coming from the second floor. Whoever I saw was downstairs. I felt a chill. Did you tell the police that? Yeah, they wrote it down, but no one ever followed up. Next, I found Patricia Voss, the school counselor. She was retired now, living in a small house near the coast. She invited me in, offered me tea, and sat across from me in her living room. I think about Elliot often, Ms. Voss said quietly. I wish I'd done more. You tried to help him. I tried, but I didn't push hard enough. I should have involved child services, should have insisted on a home visit, but I thought I had time. What did Elliot tell you during your sessions? Ms. Voss hesitated. He was very guarded. It took weeks to get him to open up even a little. But when he did, he talked about feeling like he was failing his grandmother. He said she had all these expectations, and no matter what he did, it wasn't enough. Did he ever say he was angry at her? No, he said he was tired. That's the word he used, tired, like he was carrying something too heavy for his age. Did he ever mention anyone else? Friends? Other family? Ms. Voss thought for a moment. He mentioned someone once, a person he called Jay. I asked who that was, and he said, just someone who gets it. I assumed it was a friend from school, but when I checked, there was no one named Jay in his grade. Did you ask him about it again? I tried, but the next time I saw him, he said he didn't want to talk about it anymore. And then Margaret died. I made a note, Jay, unknown identity. The final piece came from an unexpected source. I received an email from a woman named Brenda Holloway. She said she'd been following my investigation online and had information that might be relevant. We spoke by phone. Brenda had been Margaret's co-worker at the Riverton Public Library for over 15 years. They weren't close friends, but they talked often during shifts. Margaret was a private person, Brenda said. She didn't share much about her personal life, but in the months before she died, she seemed different. How so? Distracted, worried. She made mistakes, small things, like misfiling books or forgetting to lock up. That wasn't like her. Did she say what was bothering her? Not directly, but one day about 2 weeks before she died, she asked me a strange question. What was it? Brenda's voice dropped. She asked me, if you found out someone you loved was lying to you, really lying about something important, would you confront them, or would you let it go? What did you say? I said it depends on the lie. She didn't respond. She just nodded and went back to work. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now you think she knew something. Yeah, Brenda said. I think she knew something, and I think it got her killed. I compiled everything I'd found and laid it out on my apartment floor like a puzzle. A noise complaint 5 days before the murder. A note suggesting Margaret didn't trust someone. A counselor's report showing Elliot was under emotional strain. A delivery driver who saw someone else in the house. And a mysterious person named Jay. None of it proved Elliot was innocent. But it proved something else. The investigation had been incomplete. Critical questions had never been asked. Critical leads had never been followed. And whoever killed Margaret Brennan, whether it was Elliot or someone else, might have gotten away with it because the system decided the answers didn't matter. Every investigation has a ghost, a figure who moves through the story, but never quite comes into focus. Someone mentioned in passing, glimpsed at the edges, but never fully examined. In the Elliot Brennan case, that ghost had a name, Jay. I'd heard it first from Patricia Voss, the school counselor. Elliot had mentioned, "Someone named Jay. Someone who gets it." But when Voss checked, there was no J in Elliot's grade, no J in the school directory at all. At the time, she'd assumed it was a nickname, a misunderstanding, something insignificant. But the more I dug, the more I realized J wasn't insignificant. J was everywhere. I started by going back through Elliot's belongings, the boxes Raymond had packed up after the arrest, the items stored in evidence, the notebooks I'd found hidden in his closet. In one of those notebooks, buried in the middle of a page of math homework, I found a small note scrawled. In the margin, Jay says people only see what they expect to see. In another notebook dated a few weeks before Margaret's death, talk to Jay about Grandma. Jay thinks I should just wait it out, says everything fixes itself if you're patient. And then chillingly, in a journal entry from September 1st, 2 days before the murder, Jay's right, I can't keep living like this, something has to change. I photographed every reference and compiled them into a timeline. Over the course of a year, Elliot had mentioned Jay at least a dozen times, sometimes in passing, sometimes in detail. But always with a strange reverence, like Jay was a mentor, a guide, someone Elliot trusted. But who was Jay? I went back to Riverton and started asking questions. I spoke with Elliot's classmates, his teachers, neighbors, anyone who might have known him. Most people drew a blank when I mentioned the name, but one person didn't. Cassidy Merrick, a girl who'd been in Elliot's 6th grade class, remembered something. I met Cassidy at a park in town. She was 14 now, tall and athletic, with an easy confidence that suggested she'd left the awkwardness of middle school behind. I didn't. "Really know Elliot," Cassidy said, sitting on a swing. "He was quiet, kept to himself, but I remember seeing him talking to someone a few times." "Who?" "I don't know. An older kid, I think. Or maybe an adult. I never got a good look. But it was always after school near the edge of the parking lot, away from everyone else. What were they doing? Just talking, but it seemed intense, like serious conversations. I remember thinking it was weird because Elliot didn't really talk to anyone." "Do you remember what this person looked like?" Cassidy frowned, thinking, "Not really, taller." "Then Elliot for sure. Maybe 16 or 17. Dark hair, I think, but I could be wrong. It was over a year ago." "Did you ever hear Elliot call them by name?" She shook her head. "No. But one time I asked him who it was. He just said, 'A friend,' and then he walked away." A friend. Someone. Older. Someone Elliot trusted enough to confide in. Someone who never appeared in any official record. I went back to the police reports and combed through every witness statement, every interview transcript, every scrap of paper related to the investigation. And I found something. On September 5th, 2 days after Margaret's death, a patrol officer named Kyle Sanders had been canvassing the neighborhood, asking if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual on the night of September 3rd. Most people said no, but one person, Mrs. Gail Pruitt, who lived 3 houses down from the Brennans, mentioned something odd. According to her statement, "I was walking my dog around 8:30 p.m. that night. I saw a car parked on the street near the Brennan house. It wasn't one I recognized, a dark sedan, maybe blue or black. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it was still there when I walked back past." Around 9:15, the officer asked if she saw anyone in or near the car. Mrs. Pruitt said, "I thought I saw someone sitting in the driver's seat, but I couldn't be sure. The windows were tinted." The officer made a note and moved on. The car was never mentioned again. I tracked down Mrs. Pruitt. She was in her 70s now, living in an assisted care facility on the edge of town. Her memory was sharp, but she seemed surprised anyone was still asking about that night. "I told the police what I saw," she said, sitting in the common room with a blanket across her lap, "but no one ever followed up. I figured it wasn't important." "Did you see the car leave?" "No, I went inside after my walk, but the next morning it was gone." "Did you ever see it again?" She shook her head. "Never." I asked her to describe the car in as much detail as she could remember. It was a sedan, she said. Older. Model. Dark. Maybe navy blue, maybe black. I remember thinking it didn't belong in the neighborhood. Most people around here drive trucks or SUVs. And you didn't see who was inside? No, but I got the feeling someone was watching the house. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Why? Do you say that? Because the car was pointed toward the Brennan's driveway, and it was just sitting there, like someone was waiting for something. I left the facility and sat in my car for a long time, staring at my notes. Someone had been outside the Brennan house the night Margaret died. Someone Elliot may have known. Someone the police never identified. I needed more. I reached out to a private investigator I'd worked with before, Sam Ortiz, and asked him to pull any surveillance footage from the area around the Brennan house on the night of September 3rd. It's been over a year, Sam said. Most businesses only keep footage for 30 to 90 days. Try anyway. A week later, Sam called me back. I found something, he said. A gas station 2 blocks from the Brennan house. They keep footage for 18 months because of insurance reasons. I got the tape from September. Heard? And there's a car, dark blue sedan, older model, passing by the station at 8:47 p.m., heading toward Maple Ridge Road. Then it passes again at 11:53 p.m., heading the opposite direction. My pulse quickened. Can you see the license plate? Partially. The angle's bad, but I ran what I could through DMV records. Got 3 possible matches. One of them is registered to a woman named Justine Halloway. Lives in Eugene. Halloway, I repeated, the name triggering something in my memory. I went back through my notes. Then I remembered. Brenda Halloway, Margaret's co-worker at the library. I called Brenda immediately. Do you have a relative named Justine? I asked. There was a pause. Yeah, my younger sister. Why? Does she know the Brennan family? I don't think so. Why are you asking? Her car may have been near the Brennan house the night Margaret died. Brenda went silent. Brenda? I need to call you back, she said, and hung up. She didn't call back. So I drove to Eugene and found Justine Halloway myself. Justine lived in a small apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. She was in her early 30s, thin, with dark circles under her eyes. When I knocked on her door, she opened it just a crack, the chain still attached. Who are you? She asked. My name is Jordan Hayes. I'm investigating the Margaret Brennan case. I have some questions about the night she died. Her face went pale. I don't know what you're talking about. Your car was seen near the Brennan house that night. That's impossible. I have footage. She stared at me for a long moment. Then she unhooked the chain and let me in. The apartment was sparse, cluttered with books and papers. Justine sat on the couch, arms crossed, defensive. Why were you there? I asked. I wasn't. Justine. I loaned my car to someone that night, she said abruptly. I didn't ask why. I didn't want to know. Who did you loan it to? She looked away. My nephew. What's his name? She hesitated. Jason. Jason Halloway. Jay. My blood ran cold. Where is Jason now? I asked. I don't know. He left town a few months after Margaret died. Hasn't been back since. Does he know Elliot Brennan? Justine's jaw tightened. I think so. He used to volunteer at the youth center in Riverton. He'd help kids with homework, run after-school programs. I think that's where they met. I leaned forward. Justine, did Jason have any reason to be at the Brennan house that night? She looked at me, eyes wet with fear. I don't know, she whispered, but I think he was there, and I think he's been running ever since. Jason Halloway, 24 years old at the time of Margaret's death. Justine's nephew, a volunteer at the Riverton Youth Center, and possibly the last person to see Margaret Brennan alive. Finding Jason became my obsession. I started with what I knew. He'd left Riverton sometime after Margaret's death and hadn't returned. Justine claimed she didn't know where. He was, but I didn't believe her. I went back to Sam Ortiz, the private investigator. Find him, I said. Jason Holloway. Last known address was Eugene. He's somewhere in Oregon, Washington, maybe California. What am I looking for? Employment records, social media, traffic violations. Anything. Sam got back to me 3 days later. Found him, Sam said over the phone. He's in Tacoma, Washington, working at a warehouse, renting a studio apartment under his name. Kept a low profile, but he's there. I was on the road within an hour. Tacoma was a 4-hour drive north. I arrived late in the evening and parked outside Jason's apartment building, a squat gray structure near the industrial district. I didn't knock on his door that night. I waited. The next morning, just after 6 a.m., Jason emerged. He was tall, lean, with dark hair and a scruffy beard. He wore a hoodie and jeans, a backpack slung over one shoulder. I followed him to a coffee shop 2 blocks away. He ordered black coffee and sat by the window, scrolling through his phone. I waited until he was alone, then walked over and sat down across from him. He looked up, startled. "Jason Holloway?" I said. His expression shifted. Confusion, then recognition, then fear. "Who are you?" "Jordan Hayes. I'm a documentary filmmaker. I'm looking into the death of Margaret Brennan." He stood up immediately. "I don't know anything about that." "Then why did you leave Riverton the week after she died?" He froze. "Sit down, Jason," I said quietly. "I'm not the police. I'm not here to accuse you. I just want to know what happened." He hesitated, glancing toward the door. Then slowly he sat back down. "I didn't do anything," he said. "Then help me understand. Because right now, a 12-year-old boy is serving life in prison for a crime he may not have committed. And you're one of the only people who can tell me the truth." Jason's hands were shaking. He wrapped them around his coffee cup. "What do you want to know?" "Start with the night of September 3rd. Were you at the Brennan house?" He looked down. "Yeah, I was there." "Why?" Jason took a long breath. "Because Elliot asked me to be." I leaned forward. "Explain." Jason rubbed his face. "I met Elliot at the youth center about a year before everything happened. He'd come in after school sometimes, do his homework in the corner, stay out of the way. He was quiet, smart. Most kids that age are loud, chaotic. Elliot was different." "Different how?" "He was observant. He'd watch people, figure them out. And once he figured you out, he knew exactly what to say to get what he wanted." "Did he manipulate you?" Jason hesitated. "I thought we were friends. He'd talk to me about things, school, his grandmother, feeling trapped. I felt bad for him. I wanted to help." "What did he ask you to do?" "At first, just small things. Drive him somewhere when his grandparents couldn't. Buy him a book they wouldn't let him have, nothing serious. And, then?" Jason's voice dropped. "Then he asked me to come to his house on September 3rd. "Why?" "He said he needed a witness. He said his grandmother was going to do something, and he needed someone there to see it so he could prove it later." I stared at him. "Prove what?" He didn't say. He just told me to park down the street around 8:30 and wait. He'd text me when to come in." "Did he?" Jason nodded. "Around 9:15 he texted me, said to come to the back door." "And you did?" "Yeah." "What did you see?" Jason closed his eyes. "The house was quiet. Elliot let me in through the kitchen. He looked calm, too calm. He said his grandmother was upstairs and that I should stay in the living room and just wait." "For what?" "I don't know. He didn't explain. He just said, 'If anyone asks, you saw her alive. You saw her talking to me. You saw everything was fine.'" My stomach turned. "Did you see Margaret?" "No, not then. Elliot went upstairs for maybe 10 minutes. I just stood there feeling like an idiot. Then he came back down and said I should leave." "Did he say what happened?" "No. He just thanked me and told me to go, so I did." "You left?" "Yeah." "What time?" "Around 9:30, maybe." 9:35. I pulled out my notes. Margaret was alive at 9:25. She was on the phone with her sister until then. Raymond says he heard a noise just after midnight. That leaves over 2 hours unaccounted for. Jason's face went pale. I swear she was alive when I left. How do you know? You said you didn't see her. Because I heard her. Elliot's door was open when I was leaving, and I heard her voice from upstairs. She was calling his name, asking him something. I don't remember what. And you just left? You didn't think that was strange? Of course I thought it was strange, Jason snapped. The whole thing was strange, but Elliot made it sound like it was no big deal, like he was just trying to prove a point to her or something. I don't know what I thought. When did you find out she was dead? 2 days later. I saw it on the news, and I panicked. Why didn't you go to the police? Jason looked at me like I was insane. And tell them what? That I was in the house the night she died because a 12-year-old asked me to be, that I left her alive and someone killed her 2 hours later? You think they would have believed me? So you ran. Yeah, I ran because I knew. How it would look. I knew they'd think I was involved. Were you? No. His voice cracked. I swear to God I didn't touch her. I didn't even see her. I was stupid. I trusted Elliot, and he used me. I sat back, processing everything. Jason had been in the house. Margaret was alive. When he left. But something happened between 9:30 and midnight. Something Jason didn't see. Did you ever talk to Elliot after that night? I asked. Jason shook his head. I tried to call him once a few days after the news broke, but his phone was off. Then I heard he'd been arrested and he trailed off. You what? I convinced myself it didn't matter. He was a kid. They wouldn't convict a kid, but then they did. And I didn't know what to do. You could have come forward. And said what? That I was there? That he asked me to be? You think that would have helped him? It would have just made things worse. Maybe. Or maybe it would have raised the questions that should have been asked from the beginning. Did Elliot ever talk to you about his grandmother? I asked. About how he felt about her? Jason nodded slowly. Yeah. He said she was suffocating him. That she wanted to control every part of his life. He said he felt like a prisoner in his own house. Did he ever say he wanted to hurt her? No, never. He just said he wanted out. He wanted to be free. Free to do what? Jason looked at me, his eyes hollow. I don't know. He never said. But I got the feeling. He had a plan, and I was just a piece of it. I leaned forward. Jason, do you think Elliot killed his grandmother? He stared at his coffee for a long time. Then he said, I think Elliot is capable of things most people aren't. I think he's smart enough to make people do what he wants without them realizing it, and I think... What? I think if he wanted her dead, he would have found a way to make it happen without getting his hands dirty. That sentence stayed with me long after I left the coffee shop. I drove back to Oregon, my mind racing. Jason's account didn't exonerate Elliot. If anything, it made him look worse. He'd orchestrated Jason's presence in the house, possibly to create an alibi, possibly to manipulate the timeline. But it also opened up another possibility. If Margaret was alive when Jason left at 9:30, and Raymond didn't hear anything until after midnight, what happened in those 2.5 hours? I pulled over at a rest stop and laid out the timeline on a piece of paper. 9:07 p.m. Margaret calls her sister Ruth. They talk until 9:25 p.m. 9:30 p.m. Jason leaves the house. Margaret is alive. 12:17 a.m. Raymond calls 911. Margaret is dead. That left nearly 3 hours. 3 hours where anything could have happened. I called Dr. Alan Morris, the medical examiner, and asked him a question I should have asked months earlier. Dr. Morris, based on the autopsy, can you determine what time Margaret died? Not precisely, he said, but based on body temperature and rigor mortis, I'd estimate she died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. Could it have been earlier? Say 9:30? Unlikely. The physical evidence suggests she'd been dead for less than 2 hours when she was found. So Margaret died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. After Jason left, but the question remained, who was with her during those final hours? Was it Elliot or was it someone else? I returned to Riverton with Jason's testimony recorded, transcribed, and authenticated, but I knew it wasn't enough. Jason had placed himself at the scene, confirmed Margaret was alive at 9:30 p.m., and suggested Elliot had orchestrated his presence. That raised questions, serious questions, but it didn't answer the one that mattered most. Who killed Margaret Brennan? I needed to go back to the people who were there that night, the people whose stories had shaped the entire case. And the first person I needed to talk to was Raymond. Raymond had deteriorated significantly in the months since I'd last seen him. When I knocked on his apartment door, it took him almost a minute to answer. He stood in the doorway, thinner, grayer, his eyes sunken. "Jordan," he said quietly. "I was wondering when you'd come back." We sat in his small living room. The space was dim, the curtains drawn. A single lamp cast long shadows across the walls. I didn't ease into it. "Raymond, I need you to walk me through the night of September 3rd one more time. And I need you to tell me the truth." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I've told you everything I know." "No, you haven't." He didn't respond. I leaned forward. "You said you were downstairs all evening, watching TV. You didn't hear anything until after midnight." "But that's not true, is it?" Raymond's hands trembled. He folded them in his lap. "I don't know what you mean." "The noise complaint," I said. 5 days before Margaret died. A neighbor reported hearing raised voices and a crash coming from your house. The officer who responded said you told him you dropped a dish. But that wasn't what happened, was. Raymond closed his eyes. "No. What happened?" He was silent for a long time. Then finally he spoke. "Margaret and I had a fight. A bad one." "About what?" "About Elliot." He rubbed his face, his voice breaking. She was obsessed with him. Not in a loving way, in a controlling way. She monitored everything he did, everything he said. She read his journals, went through his school bag, listened in on his phone calls. She said it was because she didn't trust him. She said he was hiding something. Was he? "I don't know." Raymond's voice rose. "Maybe, but the way she went. It wasn't right. I told her she was pushing him away, that she was going to lose him the same way she lost Claire." "What did she say?" Raymond's jaw tightened. "She said I didn't understand. She said Elliot wasn't like other children. She said he was dangerous." The word hung in the air like smoke. "Dangerous?" I repeated. Raymond nodded. She'd convinced herself that Elliot was manipulating us, that everything he did, everything he said was part of some plan. She said he was too calm, too controlled. She said it wasn't normal. "Do you think she was right?" Raymond looked at me, his eyes wet. "I think she was terrified, and I think that terror made her see things that weren't there. Or maybe she saw things that were." He didn't answer. "Raymond," I said carefully, "the night Margaret died, where were you?" "Downstairs, like I said." "The entire time?" He hesitated. "Raymond." "I went upstairs once," he admitted. "Around 10:30, maybe 10:45. I wanted to check on Margaret. We'd barely spoken all day, and I felt bad about the fight we'd had earlier that week." "What did you see?" "Her bedroom door was closed. I knocked, but she didn't answer. I thought maybe she was asleep, so I went back downstairs." "Did you try to open the door?" "No." "Why not?" "Because I didn't want another fight." His voice cracked. "I was tired, Jordan. I was so tired of fighting." I studied his face. "Did you see Elliot?" "His door was closed too. I assumed he was in his room." "Did you hear anything? Voices? Movement?" Raymond shook his head. "Nothing. The house was quiet." "And you didn't think that was strange?" "No. I thought it was a relief." I pulled out my notes. "Raymond, Margaret died sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight. You went upstairs around 10:30. If her door was closed and she didn't answer, is it possible she was already dead?" He stared at me, his face pale. I don't know. Think, Raymond. Could she have been dead when you knocked? His hands shook. Maybe. God, maybe. I don't know. Did you tell the police you went upstairs that night? No. Why not? Because I didn't think it mattered. Raymond's voice broke. I knocked on the door. She didn't answer. I left. What difference does it make? It makes all the difference, I said. Because if she was already dead at 10:30, that narrows the window, and it means whoever killed her did it. Between 9:30 and 10:30. Raymond buried his face in his hands. I let him sit with that for a moment. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding. Raymond, do you think Elliot killed her? He didn't answer right away. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. I don't want to believe it. He whispered, but I don't know what else to believe. I left Raymond's apartment with more questions than answers. If Margaret died between 9:30 and 10:30, and Raymond was downstairs until 10:30, that meant Elliot was the only other person in the house during that window, unless someone else had been there. I needed to talk to Elliot, but Elliot was in prison and getting access to him wasn't easy. Juvenile offenders sentenced as adults were housed in separate facilities, and interviews required approval from the court, the prison, and Elliot's legal team. I'd been trying for months. Every request had been denied, but then I got a call. It was from Monica Briggs, Elliot's former defense attorney. Jordan, she said, I heard about your investigation. I want to help. We met at her office in Portland. She looked older, more worn than I remembered from the trial footage. Why now? I asked. She sighed. Because I've been thinking about this case every day since it ended. I didn't do enough, I know that. But maybe I can do something now. Like what? I can get you in to see Elliot. My pulse quickened. How? I still represent him on his appeals. I can request a meeting with him and bring you as a legal consultant. It's a gray area, but it'll work. When? Next week. The interview was scheduled for the following Tuesday at the Oregon State Correctional Institution, where Elliot had been transferred after turning 14. I spent the days leading up to it preparing. Questions, reviewing evidence, trying to anticipate how Elliot would respond. But nothing could have prepared me for seeing him again. He was 16 now, taller, his face leaner. He wore a gray jumpsuit and sat across from me in a small windowless room, his hands folded on the table. He looked exactly the same. Calm, controlled, unreadable. Elliot, I said carefully. My name is Jordan Hayes. I'm investigating your grandmother's death. I want to hear your side of the story. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, Why? Because I don't think the full truth came out at trial. And you think I'm going to tell you the truth. I think you'll tell me what you want me to hear. A faint smile crossed his lips. Smart. Did you kill your grandmother, Elliot? No. Do you know who did? He didn't answer. I spoke with Jason Holloway, I said. He told me you asked him to come to the house that night. To be a witness. Elliot's expression didn't change. Jason talks too much. He said you wanted someone to see that your grandmother was alive. Why? Because I knew what people would think if she died. I knew they'd blame me. So you were planning for her to die. I was planning for what might happen, Elliot said evenly. That's different. Is it? He leaned back. You want to know the truth, Jordan? The truth is, my grandmother was afraid of me. She thought I was going to hurt her, and that fear, it poisoned everything. It made her paranoid. It made her cruel. Did you resent her for that? Of course I did. Enough to kill her? Elliot's eyes locked onto mine. If I wanted her dead, she'd be dead, and no one would have ever known it was me. The words sent a chill down my spine. Then who killed her? I asked. Elliot smiled, cold, knowing. You're asking the wrong question. What's the right question? He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The right question is, who wanted you to think I killed her? And with that, he stood up, signaling the guard. The interview was over. Elliot's final words echoed in my mind for days. Who wanted you to think I killed her? It wasn't a denial, it wasn't a confession. It was something more dangerous, a question that reframed everything. What if Elliot didn't kill Margaret? What if someone else did, and made sure all the evidence pointed toward him? I returned to Riverton with a new perspective. I stopped looking for proof of Elliot's guilt and started looking for proof of someone else's. And the more I looked, the more I realized. There were people in this story who'd never been fully examined. People who had reasons to lie. People who had something to gain from Margaret's death. I started with the one person who'd been in the house that night and had never been seriously considered as a suspect. Raymond Brennan. I know what you're thinking. Raymond was 74, frail, grieving. He loved his wife. He had no motive. But the more I learned about their marriage, the more I realized love and motive aren't mutually exclusive. I went back to Raymond's apartment one more time. This time I didn't ask about the night of the murder. I asked about the years leading up to it. Raymond, how would you describe your marriage to Margaret? He looked, surprised by the question. We were married for 48 years. We had our ups and downs like anyone. More downs than ups? He hesitated. Toward the end, yes. Why? Raymond sighed deeply. Margaret changed after Claire left. She became harder, more rigid. She blamed herself for losing Claire, and she poured all that guilt into raising Elliot. But it wasn't healthy, it was suffocating. For Elliot, for all of us. Did you ever fight about it? All the time. She'd accuse me of being too lenient, of not caring enough. I'd accuse her of being controlling, of driving Elliot away. The same way she drove Claire away. It got to the point where we barely spoke. Did you resent her? Raymond's jaw tightened. Sometimes. Yes. Enough to hurt her? His head snapped up. I would never. I'm not accusing you, Raymond. I'm asking. Because if we're going to find the truth, we have to consider every possibility. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said quietly, I wanted her to stop. I wanted her to let Elliot breathe, but I didn't want her dead. Did you love her? I don't know anymore, he whispered. By the end, I didn't know who she was. I left Raymond's apartment more confused than ever. He wasn't lying, I believe that, but he also wasn't telling me everything. There was something he was holding back. Next, I turned my attention to the people on the periphery of the case, the ones who had small roles but hadn't been scrutinized. I started with Ruth Chandler, Margaret's sister. Ruth had been one of the last people to speak with Margaret before she died. Their phone call ended at 9:25 p.m., just minutes before Jason Halloway left the house. I drove back to Ruth's assisted living facility and sat down with her in the common room. Ruth, when you spoke with Margaret that night, how did she sound? I told the police already. She sounded fine. Tired, maybe, but fine. Did she mention Elliot? Yes. She said he'd been quiet lately, more than usual. Did she sound worried? Ruth frowned. Now that you mention it, yes, she did, but Margaret was always worried about something. Did she say anything specific, anything that stood out? Ruth thought for a moment. She said something strange. Right before we hung up, she said, I think I've been wrong about something. I need to fix it before it's too late. My pulse quickened. Wrong? About what? I don't know. I asked her, but she said she'd tell me later. She never got the chance. Did you tell the police this? I mentioned it, but they didn't seem to think it was important. I made a note. Wrong about what? Wrong about Elliot? Wrong about Raymond? Wrong about something else? Entirely? Then I went back to the trial transcripts and reread every witness statement, every piece of testimony, looking for anything that didn't fit. And I found it. During the trial, the prosecution had called Detective Vincent Mallory to testify about the investigation. He'd walked the jury through the evidence, The fibers, the timeline, the interviews. But there was one piece of evidence he'd mentioned only in passing. A phone call. On the afternoon of September 3rd, the day Margaret died, someone had called the Brennan house at 3:47 p.m. The call lasted 6 minutes. Mallory had mentioned it during cross-examination, but he'd dismissed it as irrelevant. He said it was a call from a telemarketer. But I went back through the phone records, and I found something Mallory had missed. The call wasn't from a telemarketer. It was from a cell phone registered to Jason Holloway. Jason had called the Brennan house 6 hours before he showed up at their door. I called Jason immediately. "Why didn't you tell me you called the house that afternoon?" I demanded. There was a long pause. I didn't think it mattered. It matters. What did you talk about? Elliot called me first. From his cell. He said he needed to talk to his grandmother, but his phone was dead. So I called the house for him and put him on the line. What did they talk about? I don't know. I wasn't listening. I just handed the phone to Elliot. How long did they talk? A few minutes maybe, then Elliot gave the phone back to me and I hung up. And you didn't think this was worth mentioning? It was just a phone call, Jordan. It didn't seem important. Everything is important. I hung up and stared at my notes. Elliot had called his grandmother that afternoon, 6 hours before she died. What did they talk about? I needed to know. I went back to the detective's office and requested a copy of the full phone records. It took 2 weeks and a court order, but I finally got them. And that's when I found something that changed everything. The call from Jason's phone wasn't the only call to the Brennan house that day. There was another one. At 7:12 p.m., less than 2 hours before Margaret's last phone call with her sister, someone had called the Brennan house from a payphone in downtown Riverton. The call lasted 3 minutes. I pulled up a map and found the location of the payphone. Outside a convenience store on Main Street. I drove there and asked the store owner if they had security footage from September 3rd, 2018. They didn't. The footage had been recorded over months ago, but the owner remembered something. Yeah, people use that payphone sometimes, he said. Mostly kids, who don't want their parents to know they're calling someone. Do you remember anyone using it the night of September 3rd? He thought for a moment. Not specifically, but I remember around that time, there was a guy who used it a few times. Older kid, maybe late teens, early 20s. He'd come in, buy a Coke, then use the phone. What did he look like? Tall, dark hair, kept his head down like he didn't want to be noticed. Jason. I confronted him again, this time in person. I drove to Tacoma and showed up at his apartment unannounced. Did you call the Brennan house from a payphone on the night of September 3rd? I asked. Jason's face went pale. No. Don't lie to me, Jason. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing. Okay, yes, I called. Why? Because Elliot asked me to. Why didn't he just call himself? He said his phone was being monitored. He said his grandmother checked his call history. He didn't want her to know he was calling. What did he want you to say? Jason looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. He gave me a script. He told me to call and pretend to be a teacher from his school. To tell Margaret that Elliot had been in a fight and needed to be picked up early the next day. Why? I don't know. He said it was a prank. He said he just wanted to mess with her. And you did it. Yeah, I did it. I stared at him, my mind racing. What did Margaret say? She sounded confused. She asked a bunch of questions. What happened? Who was involved? Was Elliot okay? I just stuck to the script Elliot gave me, then I hung up. Did you tell the police? No, because by the time I realized it mattered, Elliot was already arrested, and I was already running. I left Jason's apartment and sat in my car trying to piece it together. Elliot had orchestrated a fake phone call to his grandmother hours before she died. Why? To confuse her? To distress her? To set something in motion? I called Dr. Linda Graves, the family therapist I'd consulted earlier. If a child orchestrated a fake phone call to upset a guardian, I asked, what would that Suggest? It suggests a desire for control, Dr. Graves said. The child is testing the limits of their influence. They want to see if they can manipulate the adult's emotions, their reactions. Could it be a prelude to something more serious? Possibly. Or it could just be a way to assert dominance in a situation where the child feels powerless. I hung up and stared at my notes. Elliot had manipulated Jason into making the call. He'd manipulated Jason into coming to the house. He'd manipulated the timeline, the witnesses, the evidence. But had he manipulated someone into killing his grandmother? Or had he done it himself? One person might have the answer, and I was finally ready to confront them. The lies weren't random. They weren't mistakes, misunderstandings, or innocent omissions. They were deliberate, coordinated, and they all served a purpose. The question was, whose purpose? I spent weeks mapping out every lie, every contradiction, every piece of testimony that didn't align. I created a chart on my apartment wall, names, dates, statements, connections. Red strings linking one piece to another. It looked like the work of someone obsessed. Maybe I was. But the pattern was undeniable. Jason Holloway lied about being at the house, then admitted it. Then lied about the phone calls, then admitted those too. Each time only when pressed. Each time only when caught. Raymond Brennan lied about staying downstairs all night. He went upstairs at 10:30 but didn't tell the police. He heard Margaret and Elliot fight days before the murder, but minimized it. Ruth Chandler mentioned Margaret saying she'd been wrong about something, but never followed up, never pushed, never demanded to know what her sister meant. Even Detective Mallory had omitted evidence: the payphone call, the noise complaint, the delivery driver's statement about someone else being in the house. Why? Because some lies protected the liar, and some lies protected someone else. I started with the person who had the most to gain from Margaret's death, Raymond Brennan. I obtained a copy of Margaret's will through public records. It was straightforward. Upon her death, everything went to Raymond. The house, the savings, the life insurance policy. It wasn't a fortune, maybe $150,000 total, but for a man in his 70s with mounting medical bills, it was significant. I also found something else. 2 months before Margaret died, Raymond had taken out a reverse mortgage on the house. He'd borrowed $40,000 against the equity. I tracked down the loan officer who'd handled the transaction, a man named Phil Dresner. We met at his office in downtown Riverton. "I remember Raymond," Phil said, flipping through old files. "Nice guy. Seemed stressed, though. Why did he need the money?" "He didn't say specifically, but he mentioned medical expenses. I assumed it was for himself." "Did Margaret know about the loan?" Phil frowned. "She should have. Both names were on the deed, so both had to sign. But," he trailed off, looking at the paperwork. "Actually, only Raymond signed." "How is that possible?" Phil shifted uncomfortably. "Technically, it's not. We require both signatures. But Raymond came in alone and said his wife was ill, couldn't make it to the office. He had a notarized power of attorney form. Did you verify it? We're supposed to, but honestly, we process a lot of these. If the paperwork looks legit, we move forward." "Was it legit?" Phil hesitated. "I never checked. I left his office and called a forensic document examiner I'd worked with before. I asked her to review a copy of the power of attorney form. She called me back 2 days later. 'The signature is forged,' she said. Not a great forgery either. Whoever did it tried to match Margaret's handwriting but didn't quite get the pressure right. It's close, but it's not her. Raymond had forged his wife's signature to take out a loan she didn't know about. That was fraud, and it gave him motive. I confronted Raymond again. This time I brought the loan documents. 'You forged her signature,' I said, laying the papers on the table in front of him. Raymond stared at them, his face ashen. 'I didn't.' 'Yes, you did.' The examiner confirmed it. 'You took out $40,000 without Margaret's knowledge.' 'Why?' He didn't answer. 'Raymond, if you don't tell me, I'll take this to the police, and they'll start asking questions you won't want to answer. He buried his face in his hands. I needed the money? For what? For Claire. I blinked. Claire. Your daughter? He nodded, his voice breaking. She came back. About 3 months before Margaret died. She showed up at the house one night, desperate. She said she was in trouble. She owed money to people. Bad people. She needed help. Did you help her? I gave her the money from the loan, all of it. Did Margaret know? No, and I couldn't tell her. She would have refused. She'd written Claire off years ago. She said Claire made her choices and had to live with them. But you didn't agree. She's my daughter, Raymond said, his voice cracking. I couldn't just abandon her. Where is Claire now? I don't know. She left the next day, said she'd pay me back. I haven't heard from her since. I sat back, processing. Raymond, do you realize how this looks? You secretly gave $40,000 to your daughter, your wife didn't. No. And 2 months later, she's dead and you inherit everything. I didn't kill her, Raymond shouted, his voice raw. I swear to God I didn't kill her. Then who did? He shook his head, tears streaming down his face. I don't know. I left Raymond's apartment and sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel. Claire, Margaret's estranged daughter, Elliot's mother, the woman who'd abandoned her son and disappeared for years. She'd come back 3 months before Margaret died. She'd asked Raymond for money. Then she vanished again. Was it a coincidence or was it connected? I needed Claire Brennan. I called Sam Ortiz, the private investigator. Find her, I said. Claire Brennan. Last known contact was June 2018 in Riverton. She's somewhere. Find her. Sam worked fast. Within a week, he had a lead. Found a Claire Brennan in Sacramento, Sam said over the phone. Age matches. Background checks out. She's working under a different last name, Martinez. But it's her. Send me the address. I was on the road to Sacramento the next morning. Claire lived in a run-down apartment complex on the east side of the city. The building was stained, the paint peeling, the parking lot littered with trash. I knocked on her door. A woman answered. She was in her mid-40s, thin with dark circles under her eyes and streaks of gray in her brown hair. She looked nothing like the vibrant young woman I'd seen in old family photos. Claire Brennan? I asked. She froze. Who's asking? My name is Jordan Hayes. I'm investigating your mother's death. Her face went pale. I don't know anything about that. Can we talk? She hesitated, then stepped aside. The apartment was small, cluttered with second-hand furniture and boxes. Claire sat on the couch, arms crossed defensively. I haven't seen my mother in years, she said. That's not true. You saw her in June 2018. Her jaw tightened. Who told you that? Your father. She looked away. Fine. I saw her. So what? Why did you come back? I needed help. I was in trouble. What kind of trouble? She didn't answer. Claire, your mother is dead. Your son is in prison for life. If you know something, anything, you need to tell me. She lit a cigarette, her hands shaking. I didn't kill her, if that's what you're asking. I'm not asking that. I'm asking if you know who did. She took a long drag, exhaling smoke slowly. My mother hated me. She blamed me for everything, for leaving, for having Elliot, for not being the daughter she wanted. When I came back, I thought maybe she'd changed. But she hadn't. What happened? I asked her for money. She refused. She said I didn't deserve it. She said I was a failure. Disgrace. She said Elliot was better off without me. Claire's voice cracked. I told her to go to hell and I left. Did you see Elliot? No, she wouldn't let me. She said I'd already done enough damage. Did you ever go back to the house? No. Did you talk to your father again? She hesitated. Once, a few weeks later, he gave me some money, told me not to tell my mother. I took it and left. Did you know Margaret was going to die? Claire looked at me, her eyes hard. No. but I wasn't surprised when she did. Why? Because my mother made enemies. She was controlling, judgmental, impossible to please. She pushed everyone away. It was only a matter of time before someone pushed back. Do you think Elliot killed her? Claire's face twisted. I don't know my son. I gave him up. I have no idea what he's capable of. Do you care? She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I don't know that either. I left Sacramento more confused than ever. Claire had motive. Years of resentment, rejection, and rage. Raymond had motive. Financial desperation, a secret loan, a dying marriage. Jason had been manipulated into being at the house, into making phone calls, into creating a false timeline. And Elliot? Elliot had orchestrated all of it. But orchestrating isn't the same as killing. I went back to my apartment and stared at the wall of evidence. Everyone had lied. Everyone had something to hide. And everyone had a reason to want Margaret Brennan dead. The question wasn't who could have killed her. The question was who did. And I was starting to think the answer was more complicated than anyone imagined. I'd been chasing ghosts for months. Lies, half-truths, contradictions. A web so tangled that every time I pulled one thread, 3 more appeared. But there was one person I kept coming back to. The person at the center of it all. The one who'd been silent through the entire investigation, the trial, the appeals. The person everyone had underestimated. Elliot Brennan. I requested another meeting. This time I came alone. No attorney, no observer. Just me, a recording device, and a list of questions I'd been refining for weeks. The prison approved the visit. When I walked into the interview room, Elliot was already seated. He'd grown again, 17 now, almost a man. His face had lost some of its boyish softness. His eyes were sharper, more focused. He watched me sit down with that same unreadable expression I'd seen 100 times in photographs. Back again, he said. I need answers, Elliot. You need a story, he corrected. Answers are boring. Stories are what people remember. I set the recorder on the table between us. Do you mind? He shrugged. Record whatever you want. Doesn't change anything. I pressed record. Let's start with Jason Holloway, I said. You asked him to come to the house the night your grandmother died. You had him call from a payphone earlier that day pretending to be a teacher. You orchestrated his presence. Why? Elliot tilted his head. Because I knew what was going to happen. You knew your grandmother was going to die. I knew someone would die eventually, he said calmly. That house, it was a pressure cooker. Everyone was lying. Everyone was hiding something. My grandmother, my grandfather, even me. Something had to give. So you planned for it. I prepared for it. There's a difference. Explain the difference. Elliot leaned back in his chair. Planning means you make something happen. Preparing means you're ready when it does. I didn't kill my grandmother, Jordan, but I knew that if something happened to her, people would blame me. So I made sure there were witnesses. I made sure there was a timeline. I made sure there was reasonable doubt. Except the jury didn't see it that way. He smiled faintly. Because my attorney was terrible and the prosecution told a better story, but that's not my fault. You manipulated Jason, you used him. I gave him a choice, Elliot said. He could have said no at any point, he didn't. That's on him. I switched tactics. Tell me about your mother. Elliot's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. What about her? She came back to Riverton 3 months before your grandmother died. Did you know? No. Did you see her? No. Did your grandmother tell you she was there? Elliot hesitated, just for a second. Then, yes. What did she say? She said my mother came asking for money. She said she sent her away. She said I was better off without her. How did that make you feel? Elliot's jaw tightened. How do you think it made me feel? My mother abandoned me. My grandmother kept me in a cage. And my grandfather pretended none of it was happening. I didn't feel anything anymore. I was numb. Is that why you wanted your grandmother dead? I didn't want her dead, Elliot said, his voice rising slightly. I wanted her to leave me alone. I wanted to breathe. I wanted to exist without someone constantly watching me, judging me, waiting for me to fail. But she didn't leave you alone. No, she didn't. So, what did you do? Elliot stared at me for a long moment. Then he said, I waited. For what? For her to make a mistake. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of mistake? Elliot leaned forward, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. My grandmother thought. She was in control. She thought she could manage me, shape me, turn me into whatever she wanted, but she forgot something. What? That I was watching her too, learning her, figuring out what made her tick. And once I knew exactly how to break her. How? Elliot smiled. I gave her what she feared most, which was proof that she was losing control. He sat back, watching my reaction. I stopped arguing with her, Elliot continued. I stopped resisting. I became the perfect grandson, polite, obedient, agreeable, and it drove her insane. Why? Because she couldn't fight it. If I resisted, she could punish me, control me, feel like she was doing her job. But if I just complied, she had nothing. And the more perfect I became, the more paranoid she got. She started searching my room, reading my notebooks, listening to my phone calls. She was convinced I was hiding something. Were you? Of course, Elliot said. Everyone hides something, but the point is she couldn't find it. And that fear, that not knowing, it ate her alive. I stared at him. You psychologically tortured your grandmother. I survived, Elliot said flatly. She wanted to control me. I controlled her back. That's not torture, that's self-defense. And the night she died, Elliot's expression went blank. I was in my room. Doing what? Reading, waiting. For what? He didn't answer. I leaned forward. Elliot, I know Jason was there. I know your grandmother was alive when he left at 9:30. I know your grandfather went upstairs around 10:30 and knocked on her door, and she didn't answer. That leaves 1 hour. 1 hour when you were the only other person in the house. What happened during that hour? Elliot stared at me, his face unreadable. Then he said, You're asking the wrong question again. What's the right question? The right question is, who else knew I'd be blamed? I blinked. What? Think about it, Jordan. Everyone knew my grandmother and I didn't get along. Everyone knew she was controlling, that I resented her. If she died, who would the police suspect first? You. Exactly, so if someone wanted her dead, all they had to do was wait for the right moment. A moment when I was home, when I was alone with her, when I had no alibi, and then act. My pulse quickened. Are you saying someone set you up? I'm saying someone was smart enough to let me set myself up. Who? Elliot smiled. You tell me. You're the investigator. I pulled out my notes, my mind racing. Your grandfather had motive. He needed money. He'd forged your grandmother's signature. He was desperate. True, Elliot said. Your mother had motive. Years of resentment. She came back. Your grandmother rejected her. She could have wanted revenge. Also true. Jason was in the house. He could have. Jason's an idiot, Elliot interrupted. He wouldn't have the spine to kill anyone. He just does what he's told. Then who? Elliot leaned back, folding his hands. I'll tell you what I know, but you have to promise me something. What? That you'll follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it's somewhere you don't want to go. I hesitated. Then I nodded. I promise. Elliot took a breath. The night my grandmother died, I heard her on the phone around 9:40. She was talking to someone. I couldn't hear the whole conversation, but I heard her say, I know what you did. You can't hide it anymore. Who was she talking to? I don't know. But about 10 minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. Someone came into the house. Or someone left. I'm not sure which. Why didn't you tell anyone this? Because no one asked, and because I knew how it would sound. The boy who's been accused of murder claims someone else was there. Who would believe that? Do you have any proof? Elliot shook his head. No, but I know what I heard. I sat back, processing. If someone came into the house or if someone left, the timeline changes everything. Exactly. Do you think it was your grandfather? Elliot's expression darkened. My grandfather is a coward. He wouldn't have the guts, but he might have helped someone who did. Your mother? Elliot didn't answer. I pressed. Elliot, do you think your mother killed your grandmother? He looked at me, his eyes cold. I think my mother is capable of a lot of things, but I don't know if she killed her. I just know that the night my grandmother died, everything that happened, it happened exactly the way someone wanted it to, and I took the fall. But you're not innocent. No, Elliot said quietly. I'm not. I manipulated people. I lied. I created chaos. But I didn't kill her. I didn't hold her down. I didn't stop her from breathing. Someone else did that. Who? Elliot stood up, signaling the guard. That's what you're here to find out, isn't it? The interview ended. I sat alone in the room for a long time, staring at the recorder. Elliot Brennan was many things: manipulative, calculating, cold. But was he a killer? I didn't know anymore. What I did know was this: someone killed Margaret Brennan, and that someone had been smart enough to make sure a 12-year-old boy took the blame. The question was, who? I left the prison and drove back to Riverton. I had one more person to confront. And this time, I wasn't leaving without the truth. I pulled up outside Raymond Brennan's apartment just after 9 p.m. The lights were on. I knocked on the door. Raymond answered, looking older and more frail than ever. Jordan, he said wearily. What now? We need to talk, Raymond. One more time. He stepped aside and let me in. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of the room, my notes in hand. The night Margaret died, I said, someone else was in that house. Elliot heard the front door open and close around 9:50 p.m. He heard Margaret on the phone saying, I know what you did. You can't hide it anymore. And then, 10 minutes later, someone entered or left the house. Raymond stared at me, his face pale. Who was it, Raymond? He didn't answer. Was it you? Did you go upstairs and kill your wife? No. Then who? Raymond's hands were shaking. He sat down heavily on the couch, his head in his hands. I didn't know, he whispered. I swear I didn't know. Till it was too late. Know what? He looked up at me, his eyes filled with tears. Claire, he said. It was Claire. The room went silent. She came back that night. Raymond continued, his voice breaking. She called me earlier in the day, said she needed to see Margaret. I told her not to. Come. I told her it would only make things worse, but she didn't listen. She showed up around 9:45. She went upstairs to talk to Margaret. I stayed downstairs because I didn't want to hear them fight. What happened? I don't know. I heard raised voices. Then it went quiet. Then Claire came. Downstairs, and she was shaking. She said, It's done, she's gone. I didn't understand at first. Then I went upstairs, and I saw. He broke down, sobbing. You saw Margaret dead. He nodded. Claire told me to call 911. She said to wait a few hours, make it look like I just found her. She said if I'd told the truth, we'd both go to prison. She said Elliot would be fine. He was a kid, they'd go easy on him. And you believed her. I didn't know what else to do, Raymond shouted. She's my daughter. I couldn't turn her in. So you let Elliot take the fall. Raymond buried his face in his hands. I thought they'd figure it out. I thought someone would find the truth, but they didn't. And by the time I realized Elliot was going to be convicted, it was too late. I stared at him, rage boiling in my chest. You let an innocent child go to prison for life to protect your daughter. I know, Raymond whispered. God forgive me, I know. I pulled out my phone and called the police. Raymond didn't resist. He sat on the couch, broken, as I gave my statement. Within hours, a warrant was issued for Claire Brennan's arrest. And the truth, the real truth, finally started to come to light. The arrest warrant for Claire Brennan was issued on a cold morning in November, nearly 2 years after Margaret's death. By then, I'd handed everything over to the authorities. Raymond's confession, the phone records, Jason's testimony, the timeline that proved Elliot couldn't have been the eye. Only one involved. But Claire was gone. She'd disappeared from her Sacramento apartment the same day I'd interviewed her. The landlord said she'd packed up in the middle of the night, left no forwarding address, paid 3 months' rent in cash to avoid questions. She knew I was closing in. And the Riverton Police Department, now under intense scrutiny for their botched investigation, issued a nationwide alert. The FBI got involved. Claire's photo appeared on news stations across the country. Claire Brennan, 46, wanted in connection with the 2018 murder of Margaret Brennan. But weeks passed, then months, no sightings, no leads, no trace. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. Meanwhile, Raymond Brennan was arrested and charged as an accessory after the fact. He didn't fight it. He pleaded guilty almost immediately, his voice barely a whisper in the courtroom. "I'm sorry," he said during his sentencing hearing. "I'm so sorry." He was sentenced to 8 years in prison. At his age, with his failing health, it might as well have been a life sentence. Elliot's case, on the other hand, became a whirlwind. Monica Briggs filed an emergency motion for a new trial based on newly discovered evidence. The motion included Raymond's confession, Jason's full testimony, and the evidence the original investigation had ignored: the phone calls, the car outside the house, the delivery driver's statement. The motion was granted. Elliot Brennan was given a new trial. But this time, everything was different. The prosecution, led by a new district attorney after Sharon Vance resigned under pressure, approached the case cautiously. They knew they couldn't prove Elliot killed Margaret. The timeline didn't support it. The evidence didn't support it. But they also couldn't prove he was entirely innocent. Elliot had lied. He'd manipulated witnesses. He'd orchestrated a false timeline. Even if he didn't commit the murder, he'd obstructed justice. The trial lasted 3 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the back row, watching as the story I'd spent 2 years piecing together unfolded in front of a new jury. The defense presented Jason Holloway, who testified that Elliot had asked him to be at the house, to make phone calls, to create an alibi. Jason admitted he'd been manipulated, but he also testified that Margaret had been alive when he left at 9:30 p.m. The prosecution tried to argue that Elliot could have killed her after Jason left, but the defense countered with Raymond's confession. Raymond had admitted that Claire arrived at 9:45 p.m. and went upstairs to confront Margaret. The medical examiner testified again. This time, he was pressed harder on the timeline. He admitted that based on the state of the body, Margaret had likely died between 10 and 10:30 p.m. after Jason left, but during the window when Claire was in the house. The defense also presented evidence the jury in the first trial had never seen: the note Margaret had written 3 days before her death. "I can't keep doing this. I don't know who to trust anymore." The defense argued that Margaret had been afraid, not of Elliot, but of someone else. Someone she'd recently discovered had deceived her. Claire. Margaret had found out that Raymond had given Claire $40,000. She'd found out he'd forged her signature, and she'd confronted him about it. That's what the fight on August 29th had been about. The noise complaint the police had dismissed as irrelevant. And that's what Margaret's phone call with Ruth had meant when she said, "I think I've been wrong about something. I need to fix it before it's too late." She hadn't been talking about Elliot. She'd been talking about Raymond, about Claire, about the lies that had been festering in her house for months. The prosecution's case fell apart. On the 6th day of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict: not guilty. Elliot Brennan walked out of that courtroom a free man. He was 19 years old. He'd spent nearly 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. The media descended on him immediately. Cameras, microphones, reporters shouting questions. Elliot said nothing. He just walked through the crowd, his face blank, his hands in his pockets, and disappeared into a waiting car. I tried to reach him after the trial. I called, I emailed, I left messages. He never responded. I understood why. Elliot had been used by everyone. His mother, his grandfather, the justice system. Even me. I'd spent 2 years dissecting his life, exposing his secrets, forcing him to relive the worst moments of his childhood. He owed me nothing, but I still had questions, and I wasn't the only one. The investigation into Claire Brennan continued. The FBI tracked her movements through financial records, a credit card charge here, a cash withdrawal there. She was moving west toward the coast, staying in cheap motels and paying in cash. Then, 6 months after the warrant was issued, she was found. In a small town in Northern California, a sheriff's deputy pulled over a car for a broken taillight. The driver gave a fake name, but when the deputy ran her fingerprints, they matched Claire Brennan. She was extradited to Oregon within a week. Her trial began in the spring of 2021. I attended that trial too, not as an investigator this time, but as a witness. I testified about my interview with Claire in Sacramento, about the bitterness in her voice when she talked about her mother, about the way she'd said, it was only a matter of time before someone pushed back. The prosecution built their case around Raymond's confession and the timeline. They argued that Claire had gone to the Brennan house on the night of September 3rd, confronted Margaret about years of resentment and rejection, and in a fit of rage, killed her. The defense argued that Raymond's confession was unreliable, that he was a sick elderly man trying to protect his daughter, and that his memory of that night was flawed. But the evidence told a different story. Phone records showed Claire had called Raymond from a burner phone earlier that day, telling him she was coming to the house. The gas station footage showed her car passing through Riverton at 9:47 p.m., exactly when Raymond said she'd arrived. And then there was the testimony of a woman named Linda Costas, a clerk at a convenience store 2 miles from the Brennan house. Linda testified that a woman matching Claire's description had come into the store around 10:45 p.m. on September 3rd. She'd bought a pack of cigarettes and a bottle of water. Linda remembered her because the woman's hands were shaking and she seemed rattled. She kept looking over her shoulder, Linda said on the stand, like she was afraid someone was following her. The prosecution argued that Claire had killed Margaret around 10:01 p.m., fled the eyes house in a panic, and stopped at the convenience store to calm down before leaving town. The defense tried to poke holes in the timeline, but it held. The jury deliberated for 2 days. When they returned, the verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. Claire was sentenced to 25 years to life. She showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She just stared straight ahead, her face blank. She looked exactly like her son. After the trial, I sat in my car outside the courthouse, trying to process everything. For 2 years, I'd been chasing the truth, and now that I had it, I didn't know what to do with it. Margaret Brennan was dead, killed by her own daughter in a moment of rage and resentment. Raymond Brennan was in prison, his life destroyed by the choice to protect Claire over Elliot. Elliot Brennan was free, but scarred, emotionally, psychologically, irreparably, and Claire Brennan would spend the rest of her life behind bars, paying for the murder she'd committed and the lies she'd told. There were no winners, only survivors. I thought about what Elliot had said during our last interview. "You're asking the wrong question." He'd been right. The question was never just who killed Margaret Brennan. The question was why. And the answer was as old as time: fear, resentment, and the desperate need for control. Margaret feared losing Elliot the way she'd lost Claire, so she suffocated him with rules and suspicion. Claire resented being rejected and replaced, so she lashed out in the only way she knew how, with violence. Raymond feared confrontation, so he chose silence and complicity over truth. And Elliot? Elliot learned that the world rewards those who control the narrative, who stay calm, who manipulate the game. He'd been accused of a murder he didn't commit. He'd been convicted by a system that cared more about closure than justice. And he'd survived by becoming exactly what everyone feared he was: cold, calculating, and untouchable. I never saw Elliot again after the trial, but a year later, I received a package in the mail. No return address, just a small box with my name on it. Inside was a single item, a notebook. The pages were filled with Elliot's handwriting, neat, precise. At the top of the first page, in capital letters, it said, "The quietest boy in the room." It was his story, his version of events, everything that had happened from his perspective: the manipulation, the fear, the nights he lay awake wondering if his grandmother would ever stop watching him. And at the very end, on the last page, there was a single sentence: "The truth doesn't need to be real. It just needs to be convincing." I read those words over and over, and I realized Elliot had known all along. He'd known that in a world driven by narratives, the person who tells the best story wins. He didn't need to prove his innocence. He just needed to create enough doubt. He didn't need justice. He just needed survival. And he'd survived. I closed the notebook and set it on my desk. The case was over. The documentary was finished. The truth, or at least a version of it, had been told. But as I sat there in the quiet of my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot had taught me something I wasn't sure I wanted to. Know that in the end, the truth is just another story, and the best storytellers are the ones who walk away free. The end epilogue. 3 years after Claire Brennan's conviction, I received one more message. It was an email, no subject line, just 2 words: "Thank you." The sender's address was anonymous, routed through an encrypted server, but I knew who it was from: Elliot. I never responded. Some stories don't need an ending. They just need someone to tell them, and sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that echo the longest.